This man was the most powerful mob boss you've never heard of. While others craved headlines, Russell Bufalino built an empire from the shadows. He controlled unions, influenced the CIA, and holds the secrets to Jimmy Hoffa's fate. The true story is more shocking than any movie. Want the full story of the Quiet Don? Click the link to watch the complete, in-depth documentary. Before we begin, I must offer a clear disclaimer. The story you are about to hear is a composite narrative, a tapestry woven from countless threads of publicly available records, federal court documents, declassified FBI files, journalistic investigations, and the published testimonies of informants and law enforcement. It is a reconstruction, painstakingly assembled from disparate and often conflicting sources. Our sole purpose is to present a coherent, factual account, to deliver correct information to you, the viewer, in a digestible and engaging format. This is not a glorification but an examination, a deep dive into a hidden history. If you are ready to step into the silence where real power resides, then please, do us the favor of subscribing to the channel and hitting the notification bell. It is your support that allows us to bring these meticulously researched stories into the light. Now, settle in, relax, and let the story unfold. The story of Liborio Bellomo begins not in the hushed, oak-paneled backrooms of social clubs, but under the relentless, vibrant sun of post-war East Harlem. He was born in 1956, a time when the neighborhood was a simmering melting pot of Italian and Puerto Rican immigrants, a landscape defined by crowded tenements, the rhythmic thump of stickball in the streets, and the ever-present aroma of simmering gravy from open windows. This was a world of sharp contrasts, where close-knit family bonds existed alongside the brutal economics of survival. The Genovese Crime Family, then under the formidable reign of Vito Genovese himself, was not some distant, mythical entity here. It was a fact of life, a parallel government. Its tendrils reached into every aspect of the neighborhood, from the unions that controlled the docks and construction sites to the small businesses that needed protection to operate in peace. For a young boy watching from the stoop, the men who operated in this world were not monsters, they were local fixtures. They were the well-dressed men who drove big cars, commanded immediate respect with a mere nod, and seemed to possess the ultimate answers to the struggles of everyday life. They represented a perverse form of aspiration, a dark ladder out of the confines of poverty and anonymity. It was in this fertile ground that the boy known as Barney, a nickname that would stick far more than his given name, Liborio, first absorbed the silent lessons of power. He learned that volume was not strength. The loudest man in the room was often the weakest, compensating for a lack of real authority. True power, he observed, was quiet. It was in the unspoken understanding, the subtle gesture, the patience to wait and watch. The neighborhood was his first classroom, and its curriculum was street-level calculus, assessing loyalties, measuring threats, understanding the flow of illicit commerce, and recognizing that violence was a tool of last resort, not first impulse. A reckless display of force brought police attention and internal discord. A strategic, whispered word could achieve the same end with far greater efficiency and less mess. This doctrine of quiet control would become the bedrock of his entire philosophy. As a teenager, his education became more direct and hands-on. He wasn't destined for college halls. His alma mater was the street corner, the social club front, the loading dock. He ran errands, carried messages, and served as a lookout, each minor task a test of his reliability, his discretion, and his nerve. He was being graded not on written exams, but on his ability to remain calm under pressure, to remember detailed instructions without writing them down, and to offer nothing, not even a stray glance, to any passing police officer. He understood early that the foundation of this life was not just making money, but enforcing omerta, the code of silence. It was a code that demanded more than just not speaking to authorities. It demanded a complete internal recalibration where loyalty to the family superseded all else, including one's own conscience or the laws of the state outside. Barney proved a prodigy in this art of secrecy. He cultivated a demeanor that was neither intimidating nor flashy. He was often described as calm, polite, almost bland in his effect, a perfect camouflage. While others sought notoriety, he sought invisibility. His rise was not marked by headlines but by gradual, unseen accretions of responsibility. He earned his buttons, becoming a made man in the Genovese family, an event shrouded in the utmost secrecy, a ritual binding him to the life with blood and oath. This was the culmination of his East Harlem education, a transition from apprentice to a formal soldier in one of the most powerful criminal enterprises on earth. Yet, even as a made man, Bellomo's approach remained distinct. He was not a street brawler or a flamboyant earner drawing heat. He was a thinker, a planner, a student of structure. He recognized that the real wealth and lasting power lay not in street rackets alone, but in the infiltration of legitimate business and labor unions. He began to involve himself in the concrete pouring industry, a sector notorious for its corruption and mob ties in New York. Here, he could apply his quiet pressure, using the threat of the family's muscle to secure lucrative contracts, enforce cartels, and siphon millions into the coffers of the Genovese, all while maintaining a veneer of legitimate business dealings. This was the next evolution of his education, moving from the visible economy of the street to the shadow economy that propped up the city itself. His reputation within the closed world of La Cosa Nostra began to solidify not as a fearsome enforcer, but as an earner, a manager, a young man with an old head on his shoulders who understood that the future of the mob depended on its ability to hide in plain sight, to become a silent partner in the very functioning of New York. The true crucible that would forge Barney Bellomo from a promising earner into a figure of legendary stature within the Genovese hierarchy was the tumultuous period known as the Mafia Wars of the 1980s. This was an era defined by seismic internal betrayals, the deafening crack of gunfire in restaurant parking lots, and the relentless, penetrating gaze of the federal government, which had finally decided to dismantle the five families using the powerful new weapon of the RICO statute. As other families, particularly the flashier and more volatile Gambinos under John Gotti, descended into paranoia and public bloodshed, drawing the intense focus of every law enforcement agency and media outlet, the Genovese family, under the stewardship of Vincent Chin Gigante, embarked on a radically different path. Gigante's strategy was one of brilliant, calculated insanity. The Odd Father act, where he wandered the streets of Greenwich Village in a bathrobe and slippers, mumbling to himself, to build an insanity defense. This performance was more than a personal legal strategy. It was a metaphor for the entire Genovese approach. Appear harmless, appear broken, appear utterly disconnected from the levers of power you are in fact pulling with meticulous precision. It was within this culture of supreme deception and operational security that Barney Bellomo's star began to ascend with unprecedented speed. While Gotti held court on the sidewalk in front of his rave night social club, holding press conferences for the FBI cameras, Bellomo was mastering the art of the unseen hand. He became a key lieutenant in the family's control over the sprawling concrete industry, a racket worth hundreds of millions. His method was a textbook example of quiet coercion. He didn't need to issue loud threats. His association with the Genovese name, whispered in a meeting, was enough. Construction company owners knew that refusing to pay the required tax or use the mob-controlled concrete and union labor meant sudden, inexplicable problems. Delivery trucks would break down, essential permits would be delayed, or peaceful picket lines would materialize, halting work for weeks. Bellomo orchestrated these pressures with the cool detachment of a corporate executive managing a hostile takeover. He understood the balance sheet of fear and knew exactly how much pressure to apply to maximize profit while minimizing the risk of a victim running to the authorities. This period also saw him deepen his involvement in the family's loan sharking operations, known as shylarking. This was a more intimate, and in many ways more vicious, arena of crime. It preyed upon small businessmen, gamblers, and desperate individuals who could not access traditional banks. The VIG, or weekly interest, was extortionate, and the collection methods, while often non-violent at first, carried the implicit, terrifying promise of what the family was capable of. Bellomo's genius here was in his psychological acuity. He could assess a man's breaking point, his capacity to pay, and his likelihood of becoming an informant with chilling accuracy. He preferred to let the crushing weight of compound interest and the dread of consequences do the work for him. Violence was a costly, messy failure of business acumen in his view. His success in these arenas did not go unnoticed by the aging Gigante, who was increasingly preoccupied with his legal battles. The Genovese family, always the most structured and regimented of the five families, operated like a dark mirror of a Fortune 500 company, and they were in need of sharp, young executive talent. In a move that sent shockwaves through the underworld, Barney Bellomo was elevated to the position of capo regime, or captain, in his late 20s, an age when most mobsters were still struggling soldiers. This promotion was a testament not to any single act of spectacular violence, but to a proven, consistent record of financial generation, strategic thinking, and, above all, impeccable discretion. He was given command of his own crew, a faction of the family with interests in the Bronx, East Harlem, and the concrete industry. As a captain, Bellomo refined his management style. He was known to be demanding but fair by the warped standards of the life. He expected his soldiers to earn, but he also expected them to be smart, to avoid flashy cars and jewelry, to keep their personal lives orderly, and to communicate in layers of indirection that would frustrate any wiretap. He became a ghost in the machine of New York's economy, a phantom shareholder in countless construction projects that reshaped the city's skyline. The very buildings that rose as monuments to the city's growth in the go-go 80s, towering condominiums, office complexes, and hotels, often had, buried deep in their financial foundations, a tiny, invisible tributary of cash that flowed silently back to Bellomo and the Genovese family. This was his empire, not of territory marked by street corners, but of economic influence, of silent partnerships and enforced monopolies. While the world watched the tragicomic spectacle of John Gotti's rise and fall, Barney Bellomo, operating in the deep shadow cast by Gigante's bathrobe, was quietly building one of the most stable and profitable criminal enterprises in America, proving that in the modern world, the most dangerous weapon in a mobster's arsenal was not a gun, but a balance sheet and the profound, unnerving ability to say nothing at all. The year 1990 marked a pivotal, perilous transition, a moment when the silent edifice of the Genovese family faced its greatest threat, and in doing so, created the vacuum that would propel Barney Bellomo to the very apex of its shadowy power structure. Vincent Chin Gigante, the architect of the family's decades-long strategy of feigned insanity and impenetrable secrecy, was finally indicted on federal racketeering charges. While Gigante would wage a lengthy, bizarre legal battle for years, his direct, day-to-day command became untenable. The family needed a new operational leader, a street boss or acting boss, who could steer the ship through the storm of prosecutions without attracting the lightning. The choice, made in whispered consultations among the family's remaining elder statesmen, fell upon the young, preternaturally calm Barney Bellomo. His elevation to acting boss in his mid-30s was nothing short of astonishing, making him one of the youngest individuals to ever hold such a position in the history of the American Mafia. This was not a reward for charisma or brutality. It was a promotion born of sheer, cold necessity. In an era when the FBI was flipping high-ranking made men with terrifying efficiency using the draconian sentences promised by RICO, the Genovese needed a boss who was the human embodiment of a firewall, discreet, intelligent, paranoid, and financially savvy enough to keep the money flowing while the legal tempest raged. Bellomo stepped into this role with a seamless, almost eerie grace. He understood that his primary duty was not expansion, but preservation. He instituted a security protocol so extreme it became legendary even among other crime families. Direct meetings with him became rarer than ever. He communicated through a complex relay system of trusted intermediaries, often using innocent-sounding phrases and coded references that sounded like mundane business talk. He avoided telephones, understanding they were electronic snares. When meetings were absolutely necessary, they were held on the move, in speeding cars, on walks through crowded parks, or in the backs of anonymous restaurants with clear views of all entrances. He decentralized operations, granting his captains more autonomy but demanding greater financial tribute, effectively turning the family into a holding company of criminal ventures. His genius lay in his understanding of modern pressure points. While the government focused on traditional rackets like gambling and loan sharking, Bellomo quietly intensified the family's grip on more sophisticated and lucrative schemes. He expanded their dominance in the garbage carting industry on Long Island and in New Jersey, where mob-controlled companies charged exorbitant fees, stifling competition through intimidation and bid rigging. He deepened the family's infiltration into the airport cargo operations at JFK, a golden artery for smuggling and theft. But perhaps his most significant focus remained the concrete industry, which was booming with the city's revival. Under Bellomo's meticulous oversight, the concrete club operated with ruthless efficiency, ensuring that nearly every major high-rise project in Manhattan was built with mob-approved concrete at inflated prices, a secret tax on the very skyline of New York. This period saw Bellomo at the peak of his silent influence, a ghost boss whose name was known to the FBI but whose direct hand in any criminal act was nearly impossible to prove. He lived modestly, eschewing the gaudy displays of wealth that had doomed others, understanding that his power was not for personal aggrandizement but for the strengthening of the institution he served. He was a CEO of crime, holding quarterly meetings with his top captains to assess profits and address problems, always with an eye on the bottom line and the long-term survival of the family. He navigated internal tensions with a quiet ruthlessness, dealing with potential rivals or loose-lipped soldiers, not with public murders that sparked investigations, but with subtle ostracization, the freezing of their income streams, or, when absolutely necessary, sanctions approved by the family's ruling panel that were carried out with clinical precision and left few clues. For nearly 7 years, Barney Bellomo ruled as the effective head of the Genovese family, a period of remarkable stability and profitability even as the other families crumbled under indictments and defections. He became a mythic figure in the underworld, a testament to the power of silence and strategy over bluster and bloodshed. He was the boss who wasn't there, a whisper in the ear of New York's economy, a man who proved that the most effective way to lead a criminal empire in the modern age was to make it disappear, dissolving into the mundane fabric of everyday commerce, all while its influence grew stronger, deeper, and more entrenched than ever before. This was the zenith of the Bellomo Doctrine, a masterclass in criminal management conducted from the deepest shadows, proving that true authority needs no spotlight, only results that speak in the silent, steady accumulation of power and wealth. The impeccable silence that Barney Bellomo had so carefully cultivated, the void from which he wielded unparalleled power, was ultimately shattered not by a careless mistake of his own, but by the inexorable, multi-pronged pressure of a federal government that had finally decoded the Genovese playbook. The first major breach in his defenses came in 1996, a consequence not of wiretaps on Bellomo himself, which were fruitless, but of the classic vulnerability in any criminal enterprise, a trusted insider breaking under strain. Several high-ranking Genovese members, facing the stark reality of life imprisonment under RICO, made the unthinkable choice to violate omerta. Their cooperation provided prosecutors with the Rosetta Stone to translate the family's coded conversations and understand its layered command structure. Bellomo was indicted on a sweeping racketeering case that painted him as the central figure in the family's concrete cartel, the garbage-hauling monopoly, and its loan-sharking operations. The evidence was formidable, a tapestry of financial records, secretly recorded conversations of his underlings, and the damning testimony of men who had once sworn oaths of loyalty to him. In 1998, facing a trial he was likely to lose, Bellomo made a pragmatic, strategic decision that nonetheless sent shockwaves through the mob world. He pleaded guilty. This was not an admission of defeat, but a calculated maneuver to control the damage. By pleading, he avoided a public trial that would have exposed every facet of Genovese operations and likely resulted in an even longer sentence. He accepted a 10-year prison term, a significant price, but one he intended to pay with the same disciplined patience he applied to his business dealings. His entry into the federal penal system was not the end of Barney Bellomo's story. It was merely a change of venue. Even from within the confines of a prison cell, his influence over the Genovese family did not merely persist. In some ways, it was refined and intensified. The myth of the untouchable boss was replaced by the legend of the incarcerated CEO. He adapted his communication protocols to the harsh realities of prison monitoring, relying on trusted visitors, meticulous written correspondence veiled in innocuous family talk, and the unshakable loyalty of a regime he had built on respect and fear. He continued to settle disputes, approve new members, and direct major financial decisions. The family, in a testament to the institutional structure he had helped fortify, did not descend into chaos in his absence. It operated like a well-programmed machine, with its captains running their crews and sending tribute upline, knowing that Bellomo, though physically distant, remained the ultimate arbiter. His word, passed through a complex relay, was still law. This period showcased the profound depth of the Genovese family's difference from its rivals. While the imprisonment of a John Gotti had led to the rapid, chaotic disintegration of the Gambino family, the imprisonment of Barney Bellomo became a stress test that the Genovese passed with chilling efficiency. He served his time not as a broken man, but as a revered elder, a don in exile whose counsel was sought by mobsters from other families and whose very presence on a prison yard commanded a deference that corrections officers could observe but not fully comprehend. He read constantly, honed his legal mind, and waited. His release in 2006 was not a return to the streets of East Harlem, but a re-entry into a different kind of battlefield. The New York he returned to had changed. The mob's overt power had been diminished by decades of prosecution, but its capacity for parasitic infiltration remained. Bellomo, now in his 50s and tempered by a decade behind bars, understood that the game had evolved. Direct control of street rackets was riskier than ever. The future, he realized, lay in further obscurity. in partnerships that were even more deniable, and in leveraging the family's remaining capital into ventures that blurred the line between legitimate and illegitimate beyond recognition. He resumed his position of immense influence within the family, though now often referred to as a senior advisor or a powerful capo, titles that understated the reality of his continued authority. He focused on consolidating the family's remaining lucrative ports of call, the waste industry, the private carting sector, certain labor unions, and their enduring interests in construction. He operated with a heightened sense of caution, a ghost from a bygone era moving through a new century, proving that his philosophy of silent control was not a product of the 1980s, but a timeless strategy for survival. The government, however, had not taken its eyes off him. They understood that Bellomo represented not just a criminal, but an ideology, the very concept of a mafia that could endure, adapt, and profit in perpetuity. His freedom was brief. In 2017, a new indictment descended, this time alleging a murder conspiracy tied to the 1990s, a cold case that the government had kept in reserve. Once again, Bellomo faced the machinery of justice, and once again, he chose the path of pragmatism over a risky trial. In 2022, he pleaded guilty to conspiracy to commit murder, receiving another multi-year sentence. This second incarceration, coming in his late 60s, seemed to bookend a life dedicated to the hidden corridors of power. Yet, even this final chapter is written in the ambiguous ink that has defined his entire story. His plea was a strategic admission that secured his eventual release and protected the family from further exposure. As of this moment, Barney Bellomo remains a figure suspended between worlds, a prisoner in the literal sense, yet in the shadow world he helped define, he remains a potent symbol, a living testament to a single, unshakable principle. That noise is a vulnerability, attention is a weakness, and true power, the kind that shapes cities and outlives generations, operates in a silence so profound it becomes its own immortal echo. The legacy of Liborio Barney Bellomo cannot be measured in the traditional currencies of the underworld. Not in body counts, not in sensational newspaper headlines, and certainly not in the garish, public notoriety that doomed so many of his contemporaries. Instead, his impact is etched into the very operational DNA of what remains of organized crime in America, a permanent lesson in institutional survival and the economics of silence. To understand Bellomo's true influence is to look past the man and see the system he helped perfect, a system that has allowed the Genovese family to endure as the most stable and financially robust of the five families long after the mob's golden age had faded into history and myth. His career serves as the definitive blueprint for the modern mafioso, a figure who understood that in the late 20th and early 21st centuries, the battle would be won not on the streets, but in the ledgers, the courtrooms, and the psychology of intimidation. Bellomo demonstrated that violence was a tool of profound inefficiency, a spark that could ignite the attention of law enforcement and the internal dissent that leads to informants. His preference was for the slow, relentless pressure of economic strangleholds, the bid rigging that inflated the cost of every skyscraper, the garbage hauling monopoly that taxed every business, the loan sharking that trapped the desperate in a cycle of debt they could never escape. These were crimes of calculation, not passion, and they generated rivers of cash with a fraction of the risk associated with bank robberies or drug deals. He transformed the role of a boss from that of a tribal chieftain leading raids to that of a corporate chairman overseeing a diversified portfolio of illicit and semi-illicit ventures, always seeking to move capital from the high-risk darkness into the low-risk twilight of legitimate-seeming business. This financial acumen, this relentless focus on the bottom line, ensured the family's coffers remained full even during times of intense prosecution, funding legal defenses and supporting the families of imprisoned soldiers, which in turn cemented loyalty more effectively than any oath sworn over a gun and a saint's picture. Furthermore, Bellomo's obsession with security protocol became the new gospel. His relay system communication, his avoidance of fixed meetings, his use of coded, banal language. These were not personal quirks but survival tactics that were adopted and institutionalized. He taught a generation of mobsters that the telephone was a wiretap waiting to happen, that social clubs were fishbowls for the FBI, and that the only safe conversation was one that never technically occurred. By operating as a ghost, he forced law enforcement to construct cases not on direct evidence, but on circumstantial mosaics and the unreliable testimony of cooperators, a much more difficult and fragile endeavor. Perhaps his most profound and chilling legacy is the proof that incarceration is not a terminal defeat for a sophisticated criminal enterprise, but merely a manageable business disruption. His ability to rule the Genovese family from a prison cell for nearly a decade rewrote the playbook on containment. It sent a message to every agent and prosecutor that putting a man behind bars does not necessarily excise his influence. It merely relocates his office. It proved that an organization built on ideology and structure, rather than the cult of a single personality, could withstand the removal of its leader indefinitely. This has had a demoralizing effect on law enforcement and an empowering effect on the mob, creating a paradigm where sentences are viewed as occupational hazards to be endured, not existential conclusions. Bellomo's life also underscores the unsettling adaptability of Cosa Nostra. In an age of mass surveillance, cyber policing, and the decline of traditional neighborhood loyalties, the model he exemplified, one of deep infiltration into essential industries, corruption of labor unions, and alliances with seemingly legitimate entrepreneurs, is more relevant than ever. The flashy gangster is extinct, but the silent partner, the unseen investor, the manipulator of markets and regulations, is very much alive. Barney Bellomo did not just survive the government's war on the mob, he provided a roadmap for its evolution into something more diffuse, more embedded, and harder than ever to root out. His story is a cautionary tale that the greatest threats are often the quietest, that the most enduring power structures are those that learn to make themselves invisible, absorbing pressure rather than resisting it openly. As he spends his final years within the confines of a federal correctional institution, his physical freedom curtailed, the system he embodies remains at large, a phantom limb of the economy, a reminder that some empires are built not to be seen, but to be felt in the weight of every transaction, in the cost of doing business, in the silent understanding that some forces operate beyond the reach of the light, preferring the cool, lasting shadow where Barney Bellomo became, and remains, a legend. Not of action, but of absence, a name that speaks loudest precisely because it is never said aloud. To dissect the anatomy of Barney Bellomo's power is to move beyond the chronology of events and into the realm of applied philosophy, a cold, pragmatic school of thought that reshaped the ethical and operational boundaries of the American Mafia. His reign, both formal and informal, was a living experiment in the limits of influence, testing how much control could be exerted without ever visibly grasping for it. The foundation of this philosophy was a radical redefinition of intimidation. For Bellomo, the goal was not to inspire fear in the moment, but to install a permanent, low-grade dread, a background anxiety that influenced decisions months or years down the line. A businessman who paid the mob's tariff on his concrete deliveries was not just buying a product. He was purchasing a terrible insurance policy against a future he could not define. Delays, accidents, labor troubles, or sudden, inexplicable audits from city inspectors who might be influenced by a phone call from an unseen quarter. This form of coercion was genius in its deniability. There was no explicit threat, only a pessimistic understanding of how the world worked, an understanding Bellomo cultivated and relied upon. It made victims complicit in their own exploitation. To complain would be to admit they had entered into an arrangement they knew was corrupt, and to invite a chaos they had been paying to avoid. This psychological landscape, which Bellomo mastered creating, turned entire industries into captive markets. His power was not a hammer but a climate, a pervasive pressure system under which business had to operate. Within his own organization, he applied a similar principle of silent force. Loyalty was not fostered through boisterous camaraderie or lavish gifts, but through a clear, consistent, and mercilessly fair system of rewards and punishments, all administered with detached precision. A soldier who earned quietly and followed protocols was rewarded with greater responsibility and a larger share of profits. A soldier who drew attention, who talked loosely, or who failed in his duties would not be screamed at or immediately threatened. Instead, he would find himself gradually frozen out. His income streams would dry up as he was shifted to less lucrative tasks. His counsel would be ignored in meetings. He would become a ghost within the family, a walking example of the cost of failure long before any physical cost was ever exacted. This method was devastatingly effective. It created an internal culture where self-policing was paramount, where the fear of being ostracized and impoverished was a more powerful motivator than the fear of a bullet. A bullet could be brave. A slow, social, and financial death within the only world these men knew was a profound humiliation. Bellomo's managerial style turned the Genovese family into a dark mirror of a Japanese keiretsu or a particularly ruthless multinational corporation, where lifetime employment was guaranteed only by flawless performance and absolute fealty to the corporate culture, a culture defined by silence and subservience to the bottom line. This corporate analogy extends to his approach to innovation and market expansion. Bellomo was no dinosaur clinging to horse-drawn buggy rackets. He understood that the family's survival depended on adapting its parasitic model to new economic realities. While he solidified the core portfolios of construction, waste management, and loan sharking, he also explored and exploited emerging vulnerabilities. The family's move into the private carting industry in New Jersey and on Long Island was a masterstroke, targeting a sector that was essential yet often overlooked, where local businesses had little recourse against price-fixing cartels. His interest in airport operations at JFK showed an understanding of the value of logistics hubs in a globalized economy. There is little evidence Bellomo involved the family directly in the digital crimes of the new millennium, but his principles would have easily applied. Seek out essential, poorly regulated systems, establish control through coercion and corruption, and extract value silently. He was, in essence, a venture capitalist of villainy, seeking to invest the family's capital and reputation into ventures with the highest return and the lowest visibility. His ultimate product was not concrete or garbage removal, but influence itself, a fungible commodity that could be applied to any industry where the rules could be bent for profit. This commodification of corruption is perhaps his most insidious legacy. He proved that the mafia could, and should, operate less as a band of brigands and more as a private equity firm specializing in market manipulation and regulatory capture. The Bellomo doctrine argues that the most sustainable criminal enterprise is one that ceases to look criminal at all, that integrates so thoroughly into the legal economy that its illegal origins become irrelevant, its power derived not from the barrel of a gun but from a boardroom vote, a union endorsement, or a zoning variance granted to a friendly developer. In this light, Barney Bellomo's story transcends the tale of a single mobster. It becomes a case study in the privatization of power, a demonstration of how authority can be distilled into its purest, most passive form. The ability to make others conform to your will not because you force them, but because they have calculated, in fear and in silence, that it is the only rational choice available to them. He built an empire of the implied, a kingdom of the unspoken, where his greatest strength was that no one could ever quite prove he was king. Yet everyone, from the street soldier to the construction magnate to the federal agent, proceeded as if he were. This is the haunting, enduring lesson of his life, that in the modern world, the most absolute power is the power everyone assumes you have, a spectre of control so potent precisely because it exists only in the believing mind, a fiction that shapes reality more forcefully than any fact. The world outside the insulated, honor-bound universe of La Cosa Nostra, specifically the relentless apparatus of federal law enforcement, developed a uniquely frustrated and almost respectful obsession with Barney Bellomo. To the FBI and the Southern District of New York's organized crime task forces, he represented the ultimate white whale, not a violent, thrashing beast breaching the surface, but a vast, silent presence felt only by the deep currents he stirred and the temperature of the water. Hunting him required a complete re-engineering of investigative tactics. The old methods that had toppled so many bosses, surveillance teams parked outside social clubs, wiretaps on known hangouts, flipping low-level soldiers caught in the act of violence, were useless against a man who held no court, avoided telephones, and communicated through a daisy chain of intermediaries. The agents assigned to the Genovese family, some of the most seasoned and sophisticated in the bureau, found themselves in a maddening game of forensic ghost hunting. They knew Bellomo was powerful, perhaps the most powerful, but proving it was like trying to nail a shadow to the wall. Their casebooks filled not with transcripts of his orders, but with intricate flowcharts mapping his suspected influence, diagrams of the concrete industry, and timelines showing how construction projects coincidentally switched to mob-connected suppliers after unexplained delays. They amassed what they called a constructive case, one built not on a smoking gun, but on the overwhelming weight of circumstance, the eerie pattern of outcomes that always seemed to benefit the Genovese family and, by inferred extension, its silent leader. This forced law enforcement into a more complex, financially focused battlefield. To get to Bellomo, they had to follow the money through a labyrinth of shell companies, union benefit funds, and subcontractor agreements. They became forensic accountants as much as gangbuster agents, learning the intricacies of the concrete pour schedule and the garbage hauling route. Their key witnesses were not terrified bystanders to a shooting, but construction executives and waste management consultants who could explain, in dry economic terms, how competition had been systematically eliminated and prices artificially inflated. This shift in focus marked a significant evolution in the war on organized crime, one that Bellomo's methods had directly provoked. He had raised the bar, forcing the government to match his sophistication or fail. When indictments finally came, they were sprawling, complex documents that read like corporate fraud cases with an undercurrent of menace, alleging not just crimes, but a criminal enterprise that operated as a de facto monopoly in certain sectors of New York's economy. The victory of convicting Bellomo was always a Pyrrhic one for the agents involved. They understood that putting him in prison, while a legal triumph, did not dismantle the system he had built. They watched, with a mixture of awe and dread, as the Genovese family continued to operate smoothly in his absence. Tribute still flowing, protocols still followed. This was the most demoralizing and instructive aspect of the Bellomo phenomenon for law enforcement. It demonstrated that they were no longer just fighting men, they were fighting an idea, a resilient, self-replicating structure that could survive the removal of any single individual, even its architect. This recognition led to a more profound, and some would argue more troubling, strategy: the targeting of the family's legitimate business fronts and its embedded relationships. Prosecutors began using laws designed for Wall Street, like mail fraud and securities fraud, to go after mob-infiltrated businesses. They pressured banks to scrutinize transactions from industries known to be mob-controlled. The battle moved from the street corner to the spreadsheet and the regulatory agency. In a real sense, Barney Bellomo, by being so difficult to catch through traditional means, helped professionalize and broaden the scope of anti-mob efforts, turning it into a perpetual Cold War against economic corruption rather than a series of hot wars against violent gangs. This dynamic created a strange, unspoken dialogue between the hunter and the hunted. Bellomo's every adaptation forced a counter-adaptation from the government, and vice versa. It was a high-stakes chess game where the board was the entire economic landscape of the tri-state area. For the agents who spent decades on his trail, Bellomo occupied a space between nemesis and dark muse. They despised what he represented: the corruption, the intimidation, the perversion of justice, but they could not help but analyze his effectiveness. In debriefings and strategy sessions, his name was invoked not just as a target, but as a benchmark of operational security. How would Bellomo have done this? Became a shorthand for discussing flawless tradecraft. He was the standard by which they measured the sophistication of their other targets, and often, those targets fell short. This professional, albeit grim, respect highlights the most unsettling truth about his legacy. Barney Bellomo succeeded in dignifying, in a purely operational sense, a profoundly immoral enterprise. He made it smart. He made it quiet. He made it endure. And in doing so, he forced his adversaries to become smarter, more patient, and more comprehensive in their response, a twisted form of innovation through antagonism. The FBI's files on Bellomo are likely among the most voluminous and detailed for any mob figure who never gave a boastful interview or was caught on tape discussing a murder. They are a monument to absence, a testament to the power of a man whose greatest trick was making the government prove the existence of a shadow by meticulously documenting the lack of light. In the end, the law enforcement perspective on Barney Bellomo is one of hard-won understanding. They came to realize they were not chasing a gangster, but a virus, one that did not kill the host, but subtly rewrote its functions to serve a hidden purpose, and one that was exponentially more difficult to eradicate than any brute force pathogen. To comprehend the full, echoing resonance of Barney Bellomo's life and methods, one must turn from the closed worlds of the mob and the FBI to the broader canvas of the city itself, the New York that served as both his victim and his unwitting monument. His legacy is not etched in bronze in any public park, but it is embedded in the very physical and economic marrow of the metropolis. The skyline of Manhattan, that iconic forest of steel and glass that symbolizes ambition and capital, stands, in part, as a silent testament to his system. 4 decades, through the peak of his power, the Concrete Club enforced a mob tax on vertical ambition. The foundation of countless condominiums, corporate headquarters, and cultural institutions was poured with mixture supplied by Genovese-controlled companies at artificially inflated prices. This meant that the cost of building New York, a cost passed on to tenants, buyers, and investors, was secretly higher because of Barney Bellomo's quiet dictates. Every rent check, every condo fee, every hotel bill in a towering structure built during his reign carries, within its economic DNA, a minuscule, invisible strand of tribute that once flowed upward to him. This is the profound perversion of his power. He did not just steal from individuals, he subtly deformed a fundamental market, placing a hidden tariff on growth itself. His influence extended horizontally across the urban expanse as well, into the less glamorous but utterly essential arteries of city life. The garbage carting industry, which he helped control, meant that restaurants, office buildings, and small businesses across the region paid more for waste removal than a free market would allow. This was not a victimless crime of abstraction. It was a diffuse, persistent financial drain on entrepreneurs, a hidden cost of doing business that stifled competition and innovation, ensuring that mob-connected carters thrived while independent operators were squeezed out or intimidated into compliance. The ordinary citizen, taking out the trash or marveling at a new skyscraper, had no idea they were interacting with the economic artifacts of Bellomo's empire. This is the essence of his brand of corruption. It was ambient, atmospheric, a slight but persistent gravitational pull on commerce that diverted value into shadowy pockets. Beyond the direct financial leeching, Bellomo's reign perpetuated a culture of cynical compromise that eroded civic trust. His ability to operate with such impunity for so long sent a corrosive message to the business community and to aspiring politicians in the boroughs, that there were untouchable powers behind the curtain, that the rules of fair play were optional for those with the right connections, and that sometimes the path of least resistance was to pay, to comply, to look the other way. This normalization of corruption, this sense that the mafia was a fixed, immutable part of the ecosystem, did more long-term damage than any single act of violence. It taught generations that the system was rigged by hidden hands, breeding a quiet disillusionment that is perhaps his most poisonous, if intangible, legacy. Yet, in a bitterly ironic twist, Barney Bellomo also inadvertently served as a catalyst for the city's renewal. The relentless federal pursuit he inspired, the RICO cases and the focus on economic crimes, helped break the mob's stranglehold on entire industries. The successful prosecutions of the Concrete Club and the garbage carting cartels in the late 1990s and early 2000s, though they couldn't permanently incarcerate Bellomo's influence, did create openings for legitimate competition. Construction costs fell, new waste management companies emerged, and the airport unions underwent painful reforms. The cleanup of these sectors, forced by the legal battles Bellomo's methods made necessary, contributed to the city's economic boom in the new millennium. In this way, he was a dark innovator, his extreme efficiency in corruption ultimately provoking an extreme and partially effective response from the forces of law. The city that exists today is, in part, a city that had to purge itself of the very systems he perfected. His story is thus woven into New York's narrative in a complex, double helix pattern. One strand representing the hidden tax and the culture of fear he imposed, the other representing the cleaner, more competitive, and more transparent markets that arose from the effort to destroy him. He is a ghost in the machine of modern New York, a reminder of a time when the city's growth was subtly stunted and shaped by a criminal calculus, and also a benchmark against which the success of its reform is measured. To walk through Manhattan now is to walk through a landscape he touched but did not define, a testament to the fact that even the most silent and pervasive forms of power can be challenged, though never without a long, expensive, and spiritually draining fight. The buildings still stand, but the closed market that built so many of them does not. The garbage is still collected, but not by a monolithic cartel. Barney Bellomo's true monument, therefore, is not a single structure, but the very fact of his absence from the daily economic life of the city. An absence that was hard-won, is still imperfect, and stands as a permanent warning of how deeply criminal enterprise can embed itself into the foundations of everyday life when it is led by men who understand that the most profitable theft is not of money, but of the rules themselves. The human dimension of Barney Bellomo's story, often lost in the analysis of his methods and the scale of his economic impact, resides in the concentric circles of consequence that radiated from his silent decisions, touching lives with a cold, impersonal force. Beyond the flow charts and the indictments were people, families, businessmen, rivals, and subordinates, whose fates were irrevocably bent by their proximity to his will. Consider the small business owner, perhaps a first-generation immigrant who had saved for decades to open a modest restaurant or a construction supply company. When the pressure from the Genovese-controlled cartel arrived, it was not delivered by Barney Bellomo personally, but by a polite, well-dressed man who spoke in reasonable tones about the benefits of using a certain hauler or buying a certain brand of concrete. The threat was implicit, a chilling subtext woven into a conversation about efficiency and community standards. For that business owner, the American dream suddenly had a hidden partner demanding a share. The choice was agonizing: comply and see his hard-won profit margins evaporate under this unofficial tax, or refuse and risk the sudden, catastrophic problems that could shutter his life's work overnight. This was the Bellomo effect at its most granular, the forcing of a moral and financial dilemma onto ordinary people, trapping them in a system where playing by the rules meant breaking the law, and defying the system meant economic ruin. His power created thousands of such quiet, private crises, each one a story of compromised integrity and stolen ambition. Also, a river of cash could flow unseen into the family's coffers. For the men who served directly under him, the equation was different but no less deforming. Bellomo demanded and rewarded absolute discipline. A soldier in his crew could prosper, but he lived under a microscope of behavioral expectation. He had to be a ghost in his own life, avoiding flash, keeping his family separate from his work, communicating in code, and understanding that any mistake, any moment of loosened discipline, could lead not necessarily to violence, but to a professional death sentence within the only world he knew. The psychological toll of this existence, of maintaining a constant, paranoid vigilance in every interaction, is incalculable. These men were not free. They were high-paid employees in the most restrictive corporation imaginable, with a non-negotiable non-compete clause enforced by the threat of death. When the indictments finally came, as they inevitably did, it was these soldiers, the captains and earners below Bellomo, who often faced the harshest choices. Bellomo himself, insulated by layers and his own intellect, could strategize a plea. Those further down the chain, with less value to trade, were frequently offered draconian sentences unless they did the unthinkable, flip. The code of omerta that Bellomo embodied and enforced was, for many of these men, shattered against the rocks of spending the rest of their lives in prison, away from their children and grandchildren. The decision to cooperate was a personal apocalypse, condemning them and their families to a life of hiding, of severed roots, and of being branded a rat in a culture where that label was the ultimate condemnation. Bellomo, from his cell, remained a potent symbol of the old code, a silent judge of their betrayal, making their choice all the more torturous. Even his own family, his wife and children, lived a life of profound duality. Publicly, they maintained a facade of normalcy, perhaps in a comfortable but not ostentatious suburban home. Privately, they carried the constant weight of his notoriety and his absences. They were hostages to his life choice, enduring his long incarcerations, the omnipresent scrutiny of law enforcement, and the social stigma that could never be fully escaped. They reaped none of the illicit adrenaline of the life, only its costs, the missed birthdays, the hushed conversations, the fear of knock on the door. In this way, Bellomo's commitment to the family, in the institutional sense of the Genovese organization, necessarily came at the expense of his commitment to his family in the traditional, personal sense. His legacy to them is complex. The material comforts provided by his illicit wealth are forever entwined with the pain of his protracted physical and emotional absence. This is the human calculus of the quiet boss. For every million quietly earned, there is a businessman squeezed, a soldier morally broken, and a childhood spent visiting a father in a federal penitentiary. Barney Bellomo's genius was in externalizing these costs, in keeping the human wreckage at arm's length, ensuring it was never his fingerprints on the moment of crisis, only his influence in the conditions that created it. He remained pristine in his detachment, while the lives that orbited his sun were often scorched or frozen by its distant, relentless pull. To understand the full story is to acknowledge not just the architect of the system, but the countless individuals who were, willingly or unwillingly, the bricks and mortar of its construction, and who bore the weight of its eventual, partial collapse. Their stories are the silent counterpoint to his legend, the human price paid for a philosophy that valued the institution above all else, proving that even the quietest form of power sends out ripples that eventually break, with terrible force, on the shores of ordinary lives. As the final chapter of Barney Bellomo's physical freedom appears to close with his later life incarceration, a profound and unsettling question lingers, hovering over his life's work like a fog. What, in the end, was it all for? This is not a question of mere legal culpability, but of existential calculus, a weighing of the sheer scale of influence against the ultimate personal cost and the muted, ambiguous legacy left behind. He achieved what few in the brutal theater of organized crime ever do. He reached the pinnacle of power not once, but twice, surviving the downfall of giants and navigating his ship through decades of the most intense law enforcement scrutiny in history. He amassed, through indirect means, wealth that likely numbers in the tens of millions. He commanded the fear and respect of an entire underworld and forced the most powerful government on earth to fundamentally retool its strategies to combat him. He became a living legend, a case study, a benchmark. And yet, for what final purpose? He will almost certainly die in custody, a guest of the state he spent a lifetime outsmarting. His name, while revered in certain dark corners, will not adorn a building, a scholarship, or a public park. It will be a footnote in true crime anthologies and a detailed entry in FBI archives. A name synonymous with silent control but not with honor, not with legacy in any light-enduring sense. His family, while provided for, has endured the decades-long sentence of his absence alongside him. The vast fortune he helped generate now flows through channels he can no longer directly touch, managed by successors who may or may not uphold the pristine, disciplined protocols he instituted. The New York he sought to control has moved on, its economy transforming in ways that make his particular model of industrial corruption more difficult, though not impossible, to execute. The empire of the implied that he built so meticulously exists now as a spectre, its power diminished but not eradicated, a testament more to institutional inertia than to his active, daily command. There is a tragic, Shakespearean dimension to this conclusion. He mastered every tactical challenge, solved every operational puzzle, and yet the overarching strategy of his life, to build an untouchable, enduring criminal kingdom, was always doomed by its own internal contradictions. The very act of building such an empire attracted the forces that would necessarily seek to dismantle it. The wealth generated created jealousy and targets for prosecution. The loyalty he cultivated was, in the end, a loyalty to profit and survival, not to him as a man, making it fickle under the pressure of lifetime prison sentences. He won every battle except the final, inevitable one against the relentless entropy of time, law, and human frailty. His life becomes a grand, cautionary parable about the limits of power derived solely from fear and finance. Power that builds nothing truly lasting for the common good. He shaped the city, but only by taking from it, by being a parasite on its growth. He led men, but only by binding them to a code that ultimately demanded their sacrifice or their betrayal. He provided for his blood family, but at the cost of his presence. This is the hollow core of the silent king's reign. Contrast this with the legacy of a legitimate business titan, whose empire might also be criticized but which leaves behind products, services, employment, and philanthropic foundations. Bellomo's empire leaves behind court transcripts, a trail of economic distortion, and a blueprint for future criminals on how to better hide their work. It is a legacy of negation, of shadows, of things not said and deals not recorded. In his relentless pursuit of invisibility, he may have succeeded too well, ensuring that his most permanent mark is the absence he cultivated, the void where a different kind of life, one of open achievement and open legacy, could have been. The final irony is that the very thing he valued most, his silence, his secrecy, becomes the barrier to any lasting, positive remembrance. We remember the loud, flawed Gotti because he was a public character, a tragic clown. We remember the violent, ambitious gaspipe because of his horrific acts. But how does one remember a shadow? Barney Bellomo's story forces us to consider the price of a life lived entirely in the subtext, where every victory is secret, every emotion controlled, and every relationship transactional. It is a masterclass in operational security and a tragedy of human potential, a demonstration that one can win the game by every rule one sets and still lose in the court of history and the heart. As he spends his remaining years in a controlled environment, the world outside continues its noisy, chaotic, vibrant journey, a world he sought to control from a distance but could never truly be a part of. His quiet power, in the final accounting, purchased a very loud solitude. The empire of whispers endures in fragments, but the man who built it is left with the echo of his own silence, a profound and resonant emptiness that is the ultimate, unwilled monument to the life and methods of Liborio Barney Bellomo. The story concludes not with a bang, not with a dramatic fall from grace, but with the slow, steady dimming of a light that was always carefully hidden, leaving us to wonder if it was ever truly seen at all, even by the man who spent a lifetime carefully tending its flame in the deepest dark. To project the Bellomo doctrine into the future, to imagine the fate of the empire of whispers he helped perfect, is to engage in a speculative exercise about the evolution of power itself in an increasingly transparent yet paradoxically fragmented digital age. The traditional pillars of Cosa Nostra strength, the control of geographic territory, the dominance of physical industries like construction and waste hauling, the enforcement of loyalty through intimate, face-to-face omerta, are being eroded not just by law enforcement, but by technological and economic forces. The neighborhood social clubs that once served as nerve centers are now relics, obvious targets for surveillance. The cash-based economies of street gambling and loan sharking have dwindling footprints. The globalized, digital flow of capital is harder for a crime family to corral and tax than a local concrete pour. In this new landscape, the question becomes, what elements of the Bellomo model are obsolete, and which are more vital than ever? The answer suggests that while the specific rackets may change, the underlying philosophy of silent, parasitic, and deeply embedded control is not only adaptable but potentially more dangerous in contemporary guise. The flashy, violent gangster is indeed a dinosaur. The future, if the Bellomo doctrine holds, belongs to the criminal as technocrat, as opaque investor, as corrupter of systems rather than robber of individuals. The focus would shift from controlling the truck that pours concrete to influencing the algorithm that awards the municipal contract, or to holding a silent equity stake in the tech startup that provides the bidding software. The infiltration would target not just labor unions, but the regulatory bodies, environmental review boards, and digital infrastructure that govern modern commerce. The loan sharking of the 21st century might involve cryptocurrency-based predatory lending, where the enforcement is not a broken knee but a hacked wallet or a devastating release of personal data. The silence Bellomo championed would find its natural habitat in encrypted messaging apps and the dark web, where conversations disappear and identities are layers of cryptographic code. The patience he exercised, waiting years for a market to mature or a rival to make a mistake, would be applied to the slow, meticulous corruption of a political machine or the manipulation of a supply chain spanning continents. In this future, the ideal successor to Barney Bellomo would not be a tough from East Harlem, but a financially savvy individual with a degree in business or computer science, someone who understands blockchain, shell company networks in offshore havens, and the vulnerabilities in municipal IT systems. This individual would grasp that violence is not just messy but entirely unnecessary when you can ruin a person or a company with a well-timed data breach, a smear campaign using social media bots, or the strategic leaking of sensitive information to regulators or competitors. The goal remains the same: to create a climate of unspoken dread, to make compliance the easiest and most rational choice. The means, however, become exponentially more sophisticated, more deniable, and more scalable. The Genovese family, or an entity that inherits its ethos, could evolve into a kind of grey market private equity firm, its capital sourced from decades of hidden wealth, investing in both legitimate businesses and illicit ventures, using its residual reputation for ruthless efficiency not to break legs, but to sway boardrooms. Its power would be measured in stock portfolios, lobbying influence, and data access, not in street corners controlled. This is the logical, chilling endpoint of the path Barney Bellomo pioneered: the complete dissolution of the mob into the bloodstream of legitimate capitalism, becoming indistinguishable from it except in its ultimate, immoral objectives. Law enforcement's challenge would then magnify 100-fold. They would no longer be hunting for a boss in a bathrobe, but for a suite of algorithms and a network of anonymous digital wallets. The family would be a loose, distributed network of associates, connected by profit and encrypted communication, without the traditional hierarchy that RICO statutes were designed to dismantle. Barney Bellomo's legacy, therefore, may be less about preserving the specific institution of the Genovese crime family, and more about providing the intellectual framework for its metamorphosis. He demonstrated that longevity comes from abstraction, from moving your influence one step removed from the actual crime. The future criminal enterprise that thrives will be the one that takes his lesson to its extreme. It will not infiltrate the system. It will become the system, or at least an untraceable, indispensable part of its operating software. In this light, Bellomo's story is not a closing chapter of the American Mafia, but a pivotal volume in its ongoing transformation. His life's work was the bridge between the brute force gangsterism of the past and the sleek, silent cyber corruption of the future. He was the last great boss of the old world, and the unlikely prophet of the new, proving that the most enduring power is not seized, but seeped, a gradual, patient, and ultimately more profound form of conquest that aims not to rule the street, but to own the very code by which the street, and everything on it, operates. The silent shadow he cast may yet grow longer, stretching into a digital twilight where his principles find their most perfect, and most terrifying, expression. To truly internalize the lesson of Barney Bellomo is to move beyond the stark narrative of crime and punishment, and to recognize a darker, more universal mirror he holds up to human nature and the architecture of power in any complex society. His story resonates because it is not merely a mafia tale. It is a clinical study in the aesthetics of influence, a demonstration that the methods of control we often associate with the underworld are merely exaggerated, distilled versions of dynamics that operate in boardrooms, political parties, and bureaucracies the world over. Bellomo's genius was in stripping power down to its barest, most efficient components. information asymmetry, the cultivation of unspoken fear, the patience to leverage time as a weapon, and the ruthless prioritization of institutional preservation over individual glory. In this, he did not invent a new form of power, he simply removed all the distracting ornamentation, the vanity, the public displays, the emotional outbursts, that so often leads to the downfall of those who wield it. He understood, on an instinctive level, that overt demonstrations of strength are actually admissions of insecurity, signaling a need for validation. True authority, he proved, is quiet, assumed, and requires no advertisement. This is a principle that applies as much to a corporate CEO navigating a hostile takeover as it does to a crime boss overseeing a territory. The quiet word in the ear, the implied consequence in a stalled project, the strategic withholding of favor. These are the currencies of control in any hierarchical system where not all rules are written down. Bellomo's empire was built on understanding the spaces between the lines of the law and the gaps in human courage. And in that, he operated in a realm not entirely foreign to the legitimate world. Consider the psychological landscape he cultivated in the construction industry. It was not one of armed robbery, but of manufactured consent. Businessmen chose to pay inflated prices not because a gun was to their head in that moment, but because they had been made to understand the broader, more terrifying ecosystem of delay and disaster that non-compliance would trigger. This is not fundamentally different from the pressure felt by a small supplier facing a monopolistic corporation that can make or break their business with a single contract decision, or the chilling effect a powerful political machine can have on dissent. The mechanism is the same, the creation of an environment where the rational, self-preserving choice is to acquiesce to a hidden authority. Bellomo's mastery was in making this authority felt without ever having to explicitly claim it, a feat that required a profound understanding of human psychology, of the paralyzing power of potential consequences over actual ones. Furthermore, his approach to loyalty and institutional health was that of a ruthless, long-term strategist. He purged recklessness and flash not out of a moral stance, but because they were operational vulnerabilities. He valued discretion and earning ability over bravado. He built a system designed to survive his own absence, to be self-perpetuating. This is the ultimate goal of any leader wishing to leave a legacy, whether of a company, a movement, or a nation. To create structures and a culture so robust that they transcend the individual. In this, Bellomo succeeded where many celebrated legitimate leaders fail. His organization survived his decades-long incarceration with its core functions intact, a grim testament to the effectiveness of his structural reforms. The tragedy, of course, is the ends to which this brilliant management was applied. He was a managerial savant in the service of a predatory, parasitic cause. This dichotomy forces an uncomfortable reflection. How much of our admiration for efficiency, for strategic brilliance, for institutional resilience, is morally neutral? We study and often praise these qualities in business and political leaders, but Bellomo's life asks us to consider what happens when they are entirely divorced from any ethical compass, when the only metric of success is the perpetuation and profit of the organization itself, regardless of the human cost or the societal damage. He perfected a form of operational excellence in the pursuit of a morally bankrupt objective, proving that competence is not synonymous with goodness. His legacy, therefore, is a chilling reminder that the tools of power are immoral. Their righteousness or corruption depends entirely on the hands that wield them and the ends they serve. Barney Bellomo's story is not an alien narrative of a monstrous other, but a dark reflection of potentials that exist within any system where power concentrates and accountability dissipates. He shows us the terrifying efficiency of silence over noise, of patience over impulse, of systemic pressure over individual confrontation. To understand him is not to understand a mobster, but to understand a pure, undiluted principle of control, one that challenges us to look more critically at the quiet coercions, the unspoken rules, and the invisible architectures of influence that shape our own world, and to ask who, in our own societies, benefits from the silence they cultivate and the fears they leave strategically unspoken. The cultural footprint of Barney Bellomo, the way his story and methods have seeped into the broader consciousness beyond court documents and FBI briefings, is as subtle and pervasive as the man himself. He has never been the subject of a major Hollywood film. There is no iconic, star-studded portrayal that freezes him in the popular imagination as a charismatic anti-hero or a tragic figure. In a culture that glamorized the loud, violent, and ultimately self-destructive gangster, from Scarface to Tony Soprano, Bellomo presents a narrative problem. He is fundamentally uncinematic. His power had no theatricality, his conflicts no dramatic monologues, his victories no celebratory montages. He operated in the anti-spectacle. As such, his influence on the culture is not through direct representation, but through a quiet, creeping infiltration into our understanding of how real power functions behind the gaudy facades. He has become an archetype known primarily to connoisseurs of true crime, students of organizational behavior, and law enforcement professionals, a reference point for the ultimate professional. In the podcasts, documentaries, and books dedicated to the decline of the American Mafia, Bellomo is consistently the final boss, the man who represents the peak of evolutionary adaptation before the species near extinction. He is the answer to the question, if the mob had been run by brilliant, patient CEOs instead of volatile egomaniacs, what would that have looked like? His story serves as a corrective to the mythologized gangster, replacing romance with a cold, clinical analysis of systems and pressure. This has shifted the cultural discourse, making space for a more nuanced, and arguably more terrifying, archetype, the criminal as quiet administrator. Furthermore, his life provides a darkly compelling counter-narrative to the standard American success story. He achieved the ultimate version of the immigrant community dream through a perversion of its tenets. From humble beginnings in East Harlem to the pinnacle of a secretive, powerful institution, using intelligence, discipline, and strategic thinking. Of course, the dream was a nightmare for everyone else, and the institution was a criminal conspiracy. But the skeleton of the narrative, rise through merit, loyalty, and cunning, fits a familiar mold, making his journey a warped reflection of a legitimate ascent. This uncomfortable parallel forces a reckoning with the fine line between ambition and predation, between building an empire and building a parasite. In the realm of fiction, while no character is directly based on Bellomo, his essence haunts more modern portrayals of power. He is the unseen, unnamed force that more flamboyant characters fear or reference. He is the New York that West Coast gangsters are warned not to jalrur. He is the quiet voice on the other end of the phone that makes even the most violent enforcer go pale. His methodology, the extreme delegation, the focus on financial crimes, the disdain for unnecessary violence, has influenced a more sophisticated generation of storytellers to create mob antagonists who are not thugs, but shadowy conglomerates, their violence economic, their threats legalistic. The Bellomo archetype is the mob as a sleek, modern corporation, a concept far more relevant to a 21st century audience than the romanticized, anachronistic warriors of the past. His legacy also lives on in the language and tactics of those who fought him. In law enforcement and intelligence circles, pulling a Bellomo might be shorthand for extreme operational security or the frustrating ability of a subject to rule an organization from a prison cell. He is a benchmark, a standard of difficulty. For journalists and historians, his story is a masterclass in the challenges of writing about absence, of documenting a life purposefully erased from the record. They must become archaeologists of inference, building a man from the negative space he left around him. This has elevated true crime writing from mere sensational reportage to a more complex form of forensic reconstruction, where the story is not just about what happened, but about why it is so hard to prove what happened. In this way, Barney Bellomo, the man who sought to leave no trace, has ironically left a deep and lasting imprint on the very crafts of detection and storytelling that sought to capture him. He forced everyone who looked at him, cop, writer, rival, viewer, to look harder, to think deeper, to understand that the most significant actors in any drama might be the ones who never step onto the stage, whose presence is felt only in the careful, fearful movements of the other players. His cultural monument is not a statue, but a style of thought, a lingering suspicion that the real story is always happening just out of frame, that the loudest voices are seldom the most powerful, and that in the modern world, the most successful king might be the one whose subjects aren't entirely sure he exists at all, but govern themselves according to the rules they believe he would set. A testament to the ultimate achievement of a quiet man in a noisy world, to have his silence become the loudest, most enduring sound of all. The psychological portrait of Liborio Barney Bellomo is a study in profound, willful emptiness, a conscious evacuation of the self for the sake of a larger, impersonal structure. To understand the man behind the method is to attempt to analyze a shadow, to diagnose a vacuum. Unlike the flamboyant gangsters whose pathologies were on full display, narcissism, paranoia, a thirst for adulation, Bellomo's psychology was one of radical self-negation. He was not driven by a desire to be feared for his own sake, but to be effective for the institution's sake. His ego, if it existed in any traditional sense, was seamlessly subsumed into the identity of the Genovese family. His personal wants, his need for recognition, his emotional responses, all appear to have been systematically suppressed or eliminated, treated as operational vulnerabilities as dangerous as a loose tongue or a flashy car. This suggests a mind of extraordinary discipline, a fortress of self-control where the drawbridge was permanently raised. What motivated such a man? It is unlikely to have been greed in a simple, material sense. He lived modestly. It was not a lust for the trappings of fame. He fled the spotlight. The closest approximation may be a form of high-stakes intellectualism, a deep, almost artistic appreciation for the flawless execution of a complex, forbidden system. For Bellomo, the Genovese family was not just a criminal enterprise. It was the ultimate puzzle, a living, breathing entity whose survival against all odds was the supreme challenge. His motivation was the cold satisfaction of solving for X in an equation where X represented perpetual, profitable, and unassailable power. He was a master chess player who found his purpose not in winning a single game, but in devising a strategy that would allow his side to win every possible future game, even if he himself was removed from the board. This required a detachment from the human element that is almost inhuman. The businessmen he bankrupted, the rivals he marginalized, the soldiers whose lives he directed toward ruin or prison, these were not people to him in an empathetic sense. They were variables in his equation, assets to be leveraged or liabilities to be contained. This detachment is the cornerstone of his psychological armor. It allowed him to make decisions of breathtaking coup with no apparent emotional residue, to order a sanction or approve a murder as a clinical solution to an operational problem, much like a CEO authorizing a layoff to improve a balance sheet. Where other mob bosses were undone by passion, a fiery temper, a romantic entanglement, a hunger for the front page, Bellomo was insulated by his profound emotional austerity. He likely viewed such passions as a form of weakness, a dangerous impurity in the alloy of power. His relationships, even with his closest allies, were likely filtered through this lens of utility and risk assessment. Trust was not about affection, but about proven reliability and mutual interest. This psychological makeup raises a disturbing question. Was Barney Bellomo a sociopath, devoid of the capacity for empathy, or was he a man who made a conscious, lifelong choice to sacrifice his humanity on the altar of institutional loyalty? The answer likely lies in a harrowing middle ground. He possessed the cognitive ability to understand the suffering he caused. It was, in fact, a tool he used, but he had trained himself, or perhaps was simply wired, to assign it no emotional weight. His morality was entirely institutional. An act was right if it strengthened the family, wrong if it weakened it. There was no higher court of appeal, no divine judgment, no social contract beyond the oath of omerta. This internal world, or lack thereof, is what made him so formidable and so terrifying. He was not wrestling with inner demons. He had silenced them, or they had never spoken to begin with. His mind was a quiet, well-ordered office where the only sound was the efficient click of decisions being made. This also explains his ability to endure long prison terms not with rage or despair, but with a patient, strategic calm. Prison was not a personal tragedy. It was a change in the operational environment, a new set of constraints to be analyzed and mastered. His self-worth was not tied to his physical freedom, but to his continued relevance, to the knowledge that the system he helped build was still functioning on his principles. This is perhaps the most complete form of power one can achieve, the power to define reality itself through the lens of one's own operational goals, to see the world not as a place of joy and sorrow, but as a dynamic system of pressures and opportunities, and to reconfigure oneself into the perfect, silent instrument for navigating that system. The psychological legacy of Barney Bellomo is therefore a warning about the ultimate cost of such perfect, immoral efficiency. It suggests that to become a true ghost in the machine, one must first hollow out the soul, becoming a ghost to oneself. The quiet he cultivated externally was merely a reflection of a far deeper, more profound internal silence. In the end, the most impenetrable fortress he built was not his network of shell companies or his relay system of communication, but the chilling, vacant calm within his own mind, a space where the echoes of conscience were never allowed to form, leaving only the smooth, cold walls of calculated purpose, a monument to the terrifying potential of a human being who has successfully erased everything human within themselves in the service of an idea, and in doing so, became not a man, but a perfectly self-contained and self-perpetuating principle of control. The final, inescapable paradox of Barney Bellomo's existence is the manner in which his lifelong dedication to obscurity has, in the long arc of history, guaranteed him a peculiar form of immortality, one that is both narrower and more potent than the fleeting notoriety of his peers. John Gotti is remembered as a caricature, a cautionary tale of hubris, Sammy Gravano as the ultimate betrayer, Vincent Gigante as a Shakespearean figure of feigned madness. Their legends are colourful, defined by singular, dramatic flaws. Bellomo's legend is different. It is a legend of absence, of negative space. He is remembered not for what he did, but for how he did it, and more importantly, for how he was not caught doing it for so long. His name does not evoke an image or a famous quote. It evokes a methodology, a chillingly effective set of principles for the perpetuation of illicit power. In the annals of American organized crime, he stands apart as the great anomaly thinker, the one who looked at the chaotic, self-destructive pageantry of the mob and saw an engineering problem to be solved. This grants him a lasting relevance that flashier figures lack. While the stories of others become period pieces, locked in the era of their downfall, Bellomo's story feels unnervingly contemporary, even prescient. In a world of data surveillance, facial recognition, and digital footprints, his obsession with operational security reads less as a mafia tactic and more as a foundational text for anyone wishing to operate outside the panopticon of the modern state. His understanding that communication is vulnerability, that visibility is risk, and that institutional resilience trumps charismatic leadership, are lessons studied not just by aspiring criminals, but by intelligence operatives, activists in repressive regimes, and even privacy-conscious citizens. He demonstrated the ultimate power of restraint in an age of compulsive sharing, proving that in a world shouting to be heard, the most powerful statement can be a deliberate, strategic silence. This elevates him from a historical figure to a permanent case study, a dark star in the constellation of power dynamics whose gravitational pull continues to influence thinking in disparate fields. Furthermore, his legacy is cemented by the sheer frustration he embodied for the forces of law. Every major prosecution of the Genovese family in the 21st century is, in a sense, a postscript to his reign. The cases are built on the understanding that the family operates as he designed it to, silently, patiently, and with deep roots in legitimate commerce. Law enforcement's ongoing battle is, therefore, a battle against the Bellomo model. Each new indictment that speaks of a decades-long infiltration of the garbage industry, or a scheme to control the union, is an acknowledgement that the system he helped perfect is still alive, still adapting. He is the ghost in the machine of every subsequent investigation. Even in his physical absence, his philosophy dictates the terms of engagement. The FBI agents who work organized crime today are, whether they know it or not, students of Barney Bellomo. Their strategies are designed to counter his, to find cracks in a wall of silence he spent a lifetime fortifying. This ensures that his influence is not a relic, but an active, shaping force in an ongoing, silent war. His immortality is also secured by the unresolved questions he leaves behind, the tantalizing gaps in the official record. We know the outcomes, but we rarely have his voice on a wiretap explaining his reasoning. We have the structures he built, but not the intimate moments of their construction. This void becomes a canvas for projection. For some, he is the ultimate professional, a figure of grim admiration. For others, he is the embodiment of a cold, corrosive evil that preys on societal trust. For historians, he is a puzzle with missing pieces, a man whose true thoughts and motivations are buried under layers of purposeful misdirection. This ambiguity makes his story endlessly discussable, a narrative that resists a tidy moral conclusion. We cannot simply dismiss him as a monster and move on. We must grapple with the uncomfortable efficiency of his evil, the disciplined brilliance of his corruption. He forces us to confront the unsettling idea that the most dangerous individuals are not those who rebel against the system, but those who learn to manipulate its hidden levers with flawless, patient precision. In the end, Barney Bellomo achieved a perverse version of the American dream he witnessed on the streets of East Harlem. He built something that outlasted him. But what he built was not a business to pass to his children or a reputation for community betterment. He built a template, a durable set of instructions for how to wield power without claiming it, for how to profit from society while contributing nothing but distortion and fear. His immortality lies in the enduring utility of that template, in the chilling fact that his name will be invoked whenever the conversation turns to the mechanics of silent control, the economics of intimidation, and the terrifying potential of a man who realized that in a noisy, distracted world, the deepest influence flows through the channels of quiet, and that the most enduring legacy is not written in headlines, but in the fearful, unspoken adjustments of everyone who understands the rules of the game you never admit you're playing. He is not remembered for a life fully lived, but for a principle perfectly executed, and in that, he secured a place in history far more secure than any built on the shifting sands of fame or notoriety, a permanent resident in the shadows of our understanding of power itself. Examining the broader ecosystem of organized crime during Bellomo's ascendancy provides a stark relief against which his singular approach shines with cold clarity. The American Mafia of the 1980s and 1990s was a tapestry of contrasting leadership styles, each fraying under different pressures, and together they form a perfect comparative study for why the Bellomo method proved so resilient. The Gambino family, first under the tumultuous, publicity-averse rule of Paul Castellano and then the explosively public reign of John Gotti, offers the most direct counterpoint. Where Bellomo saw the media and the sidewalk as stages to be avoided at all costs, Gotti craved them, holding court outside the Rave Night Social Club, his tailored suits and defiant quotes feeding the newspapers and, crucially, the FBI's evidence files. Gotti's power was performative. It required an audience. Bellomo's power was functional. It required anonymity. The Gambinos became a spectacle, and as with any spectacle, the narrative had a clear, dramatic, and ultimately tragic arc that ended with life in prison. The Genovese, under Gigonti's and then Bellomo's guidance, offered no such narrative. They were a non-story, a bureaucratic entity, and thus infinitely more difficult for the public to comprehend and for the government to dramatize in a courtroom. The Lucchese family, meanwhile, was being torn apart from within by the likes of Anthony "Gaspipe" Casso, a homicidal psychopath whose reign of terror created a conveyor belt of informants. Casso believed power was demonstrated through unpredictable, extreme violence, a strategy that sowed paranoia and guaranteed betrayal. Bellomo, conversely, believed violence was a sign of strategic failure, a costly and messy admission that softer forms of coercion had not worked. His discipline prevented the internal bloodbaths that decimated other families. The Colombo family spent the early 90s in a literal civil war, with factions machine-gunning each other in the streets, a public relations disaster that made them the easiest target for federal prosecutors. Bellomo's Genovese family had no civil wars. It had quiet, boardroom-style removals, if necessary, leaving no crime scenes for the NYPD to process. The Bonanno family was crippled early by the unprecedented infiltration of FBI agent Joe Pistone, aka Donnie Brasco, which shattered the sanctity of their induction process and bred a lasting, paralyzing distrust. The Genovese, with their ultra-cautious, merit-based promotions and intense vetting, were far less susceptible to such penetration. Bellomo's ecosystem, therefore, was one of quiet, conservative stability in a sea of flamboyant, self-immolating chaos. He was not the strongest shark in the water, he was a different species altogether, a creature of the deep trench rather than the churning surface. His family did not seek to dominate the underworld through fear of its ferocity, but through respect for its impenetrability and its financial might. This comparative analysis reveals that Bellomo's genius was not in being a better gangster, but in recognizing that the traditional model of gangsterism was obsolete and self-defeating in the age of RICO and electronic surveillance. While others clung to the romantic, muscular image of the mob boss, he pioneered a postmodern vision. The boss as a ghost in the machine, a source of policy rather than orders, a brand of silent reliability rather than terrifying spectacle. This allowed the Genovese to become the bank of the underworld. Other families, embroiled in wars or leadership crises, would sometimes need financial assistance or a neutral arbitrator, and they would turn to the Genovese, whose books were in order and whose leadership was calm. This positioned Bellomo not just as a leader of his own family, but as a de facto elder statesman and stabilizing force for the entire commission, the mob's ruling body. His power was amplified because it was the power others relied upon to settle their own messy disputes, making him the central, quiet pillar in a crumbling temple. He proved that in a climate of universal crisis, the entity that refuses to participate in the crisis becomes the most powerful entity of all. His reign coincided with the final, desperate era of the mob's golden age, and he alone seemed to understand that survival meant shedding the skin of the past, becoming something leaner, smarter, and quieter. While the other families were characters in a tragedy, the Genovese under Bellomo were administrators of a declining but carefully managed asset. This is why, when the history of that era is written, the other bosses are footnotes in their own violent stories. while Barney Bellomo is a chapter in the ongoing story of institutional adaptation and the cold, hard calculus of power stripped bare of all its dangerous and enticing mythologies. He was the mob's first true modernizer, not by embracing new technology, but by perfecting an ancient truth in a new context, that the most formidable fortress is one that cannot be seen, and the most unassailable king is the one whose subjects are never quite sure he is there at all, but who governs their actions through the pervasive, quiet logic of the system he designed to outlive him. The intricate and often perilous relationship Barney Bellomo cultivated with the concept of freedom was not the binary condition of a free man versus an incarcerated one, but a sophisticated, layered understanding of where true autonomy actually resided. For most of his adult life, his physical liberty was conditional, under threat, or outright revoked. Yet, in a profound philosophical sense, he may have felt more truly free while operating from a prison cell than many of his contemporaries did on the street. His freedom was not of the body, but of the will and the intellect, exercised through a flawless command of a system that obeyed his logic even in his absence. While a flashy boss like Gotti, once imprisoned, was effectively neutered, rendered a symbol without agency, Bellomo's incarceration became a different kind of office. The constraints of prison, the monitored calls, the regulated visits, the isolation, were simply new parameters for his strategic mind to navigate. His freedom was expressed in the continued flow of decisions, in the unbroken loyalty of his captains, in the millions of dollars that still moved according to his established protocols. He had engineered his own relevance to be independent of his location. This redefinition points to a radical internal liberty. He had freed himself from the need for the external trappings of power. He did not require the adulation of a social club, the comfort of a lavish home, or even the simple pleasure of walking down a street unobserved. His sense of self and purpose was so completely tied to the functioning of the institution that its health was his freedom. As long as the Genovese family operated on his principles, generating wealth and maintaining discipline, he was, in the only way that mattered to him, at liberty. This stands in stark contrast to the imprisoned gangster who rages against confinement, who feels his identity stripped away by the prison uniform. Bellomo's identity was impervious to such stripping. It was woven into the fabric of an organization that transcended walls. This mindset required a monumental, almost ascetic, renunciation of the flesh and its desires. It was the freedom of a monk who finds God in a cell, or a philosopher who finds truth in chains. Except Bellomo's God was institutional power, and his truth was the efficacy of silence. His ability to endure decades behind bars without breaking, without turning informant, and without losing his authority, speaks to a man for whom the conventional definitions of freedom and imprisonment had been completely inverted. The bars were a minor inconvenience, a flawed attempt to contain an idea that had already been disseminated and institutionalized. In this light, his guilty pleas were not surrenders of freedom, but strategic consolidations of it. By pleading, he controlled the sentence, avoided the unpredictability of a trial, and preserved the family's secrets. He traded a measure of physical liberty for the preservation of his operational liberty. Each day in prison was not a day of lost freedom, but a day of investment in the legend of his incorruptibility and the stability of the system he built. Every visit from a captain, every message passed through a trusted lawyer, was a reaffirmation that his will was still law, that the machine was still running on his programming. This granted him a psychological freedom that few, even among the powerful, ever experience, the freedom from doubt. He never had to wonder if his legacy would endure in his absence. He had architected it to do so. He never had to fear being forgotten. His silence had made him unforgettable in the only circles that counted. His was the freedom of a chess grandmaster who has thought 20 moves ahead and sees the inevitable conclusion of the game, allowing him to sit patiently even as his opponent believes they are gaining ground. The final, poignant layer of this paradox is that his pursuit of this rarefied, intellectualized freedom ultimately required the sacrifice of every ordinary freedom life offers. The freedom to be present for his family, to enjoy simple pleasures without calculation, to retire in peace, to be known for something other than criminal mastery. He chose a kingdom of the mind over the world of the senses. He traded sunsets for strategy, family dinners for coded messages, old age in a comfortable chair for old age in a prison common room. Whether this was a tragic miscalculation or the ultimate victory of will depends on one's perspective. From the outside, it seems a hollow, chilling existence. From within the Bellomo paradigm, it may have been the purest expression of control imaginable. the ability to define the terms of one's own existence so completely that even the state's most powerful tool of punishment, the deprivation of liberty, could be rendered a mere logistical challenge, not a spiritual or operational defeat. In the end, Barney Bellomo's life forces us to expand our understanding of what freedom can mean. He demonstrates that it can be an internal condition, a state of unimpeded influence, divorced from physical location. It is a freedom built on discipline, denial, and a fanatical commitment to an idea, a freedom that looks, to the outside world, indistinguishable from the most profound and costly imprisonment. His legacy, therefore, is not just about crime, but about the terrifying lengths to which a human mind can go to preserve its own agency, crafting a prison of its own design from which to rule, and in that ruling, finding a form of liberty so austere and so complete that it negates the very need for the open air. The unspoken, yet monumental, influence of women in the world Barney Bellomo inhabited forms a silent backdrop to his story, a dimension of his life as carefully managed and obscured as his financial dealings. Unlike the volatile, often publicly dramatic relationships of other mob bosses, Bellomo's domestic sphere was shrouded in an impenetrable privacy that mirrored his professional conduct. His wife, the mother of his children, is a phantom in his narrative, a presence defined entirely by her absence from the record. This was not an accident. It was a deliberate, strategic imperative. In the old-world calculus of La Cosa Nostra, women occupied a paradoxical space. They were revered as mothers, the keepers of the family honor and the home, yet they were also viewed as potential vulnerabilities, emotional conduits who could be pressured by law enforcement or whose affections could cloud a man's judgment. For a man like Bellomo, for whom every vulnerability was a flaw to be engineered out of the system, the management of this sphere would have been meticulous. His wife would have been schooled, either by him or by the ingrained culture of her environment, in the art of seeing nothing, hearing nothing, and saying less. Her loyalty was not the passionate, romantic loyalty of a partner, but the stoic, disciplined loyalty of a soldier in a different theater of the same war. Her role was to maintain a facade of normalcy, to raise children who understood the unspoken rules without having them explicitly stated, and to provide a sanctuary that was emotionally neutral, a place where the pressures of the street could be compartmentalized behind a door that closed on a world of quiet domestic routine. She was the guardian of his one legitimate identity, the man he was supposed to be when he wasn't being Barney Bellomo, the boss. This required a formidable strength of its own, the strength to live with constant, low-grade fear, to accept prolonged absences as her husband was sequestered in meetings or later incarcerated, and to interact with the community while knowing her every social connection might be analyzed by the FBI for leverage. Her freedom, her social life, her own aspirations, were all necessarily circumscribed by the invisible walls of his life choice. She paid the price for his silence with her own. The children of such an arrangement inherit a complex and heavy legacy. They are raised with a dual consciousness, the public face of a normal, perhaps comfortable, middle-class life, and the private, unarticulated understanding that their father's world operates by shadowed rules. Questions about his work are met with deflection or silence. Celebrations are tinged with the unspoken knowledge that he could be taken away at any moment. Their father is both present and profoundly absent, his mind often elsewhere, calculating risks they cannot be told about. They learn, indirectly, the Bellomo doctrine: trust no one outside the innermost circle, avoid drawing attention, and understand that the family name carries a weight that is never explained but always felt. For a son, this could be a terrible burden, the expectation to perhaps follow in footsteps he sees leading only to prison or an early grave, or the conflicting desire to break free into a legitimate life, thereby implicitly rejecting the world that provided his comfort. For a daughter, it might manifest as a hypervigilance in relationships, a difficulty in trusting outsiders, and the crushing responsibility of protecting the family's privacy at all costs. Bellomo, in his focused pursuit of institutional permanence, likely saw his blood family as both a sanctuary and a liability to be protected. His provision for them was not just financial, it was the provision of a rigid structure of conduct designed to keep them safe from the dangers of his world and, just as importantly, to keep his world safe from any inadvertent danger they might pose through a careless word or association. They were the one part of his life he could not fully control through cold logic, and thus they had to be insulated, their environment sterilized of the turbulence that defined his professional existence. This dynamic illustrates the ultimate cost of the quiet life he engineered, the emotional isolation of those closest to him. While he built an empire on understanding human weakness, he had to ensure his own family exhibited none, at least not publicly. They lived in a gilded cage of his making, secure but isolated, provided for but never fully explained to, loved in the only way he could express it, through the provision of security and the enforcement of silence, but likely starved of the emotional availability and unreserved honesty that defines most family life. In this, the women in Barney Bellomo's story, his wife, his daughters, the mothers of his associates, are the ultimate silent partners. Their stories are the blank pages in his biography, the conversations that were never recorded, the fears that were never voiced. They upheld the facade that allowed his legend to grow in the underworld while remaining a ghost in the legitimate one. Their strength was the foundation upon which his detached, calculating strength was built, and their sacrifices, of freedom, of peace of mind, of ordinary happiness, are the unacknowledged ledger entry that balanced the books of his criminal empire. To tell the story of Barney Bellomo without acknowledging this vast, silent dimension is to tell only half the story, for it was in the quiet of his own home, in the eyes of his family, that the true, human cost of his philosophy of silence was paid, day after day, year after year, in a currency of unasked questions and carefully guarded emotions, proving that even the quietest king rules over a kingdom of unspoken sorrows. The physical landscape of New York City, the very streets and structures that formed the stage for Barney Bellomo's quiet empire, holds within its bricks, concrete, and forgotten corners a silent archaeology of his influence. To walk through certain parts of the city with an understanding of his story is to see a hidden map overlay the visible one. The route is not marked by plaques or landmarks, but by a knowledge of economic pressure and vanished choices. Start in East Harlem, where the tight, bustling streets of his youth have been transformed by gentrification. The old social clubs and storefronts that once served as casual offices for the Genovese crew now replaced by trendy cafes and renovated brownstones. The neighborhood itself, the crucible of his education, has been scrubbed clean of its overt mob presence. But the process of that cleansing was, in part, a reaction to the systemic corruption he later came to embody. Travel downtown to the courthouses of Foley Square, where his fate was negotiated in quiet plea deals rather than dramatic trials. These buildings, temples of official justice, are the counterparts to his shadowy authority. Their courtrooms are where the silence he cultivated was finally given a name in indictments, where the federal government attempted to speak aloud the things he had spent a lifetime ensuring were only whispered. Then, look upward at the skyline, that glittering testament to capital. The older towers, those built in the 1980s and early 1990s, the era of his peak influence, are the most likely suspects. Their foundations, both literal and financial, were poured during the reign of the concrete club. The glass and steel that catch the sun were erected by construction crews whose paymasters, several layers removed, kicked back a percentage to the family Bellomo helped lead. These buildings are the purest monuments to his power, anonymous, towering, profitable, and completely deniable. They contain no hint of the coercion that facilitated their rise. They simply exist, their very normality a perfect camouflage for their illicit origins. Venture out to the industrial zones of Brooklyn, New Jersey, and Long Island, the nondescript districts of waste transfer stations and trucking depots. Here, in these functional, gritty landscapes, the garbage hauling cartels operated. The routes these trucks drove for decades were not just logistical pathways, they were circuits in a machine of monopoly, ensuring that every business on that route paid a hidden tax. The quiet of these industrial areas, broken only by the rumble of compactors and diesels, echoes the quiet of Bellomo's methods, a functional, profitable silence. Even the airports, specifically the cargo areas of JFK, are part of this geography. The flow of legitimate global commerce provided a perfect cloak for smuggling and theft, a lesson Bellomo and the Genovese understood well. His influence was less about controlling a specific street corner for gambling, and more about controlling the choke points of commerce, where concrete was sourced, where garbage was processed, where cargo entered the country. His kingdom was one of infrastructure and logistics. Perhaps the most poignant locations are the federal correctional institutions in which he has spent so much of his adult life. These are not part of New York's geography, but they became a central part of his. They are the sterile, controlled environments where his philosophy faced its ultimate test, and where he proved that his authority could transcend physical space. The visiting rooms, the prison yards, the phone banks, these became the new nerve centers, the stripped-down nodes in his network. The city itself moved on, evolving, building new towers with new, more opaque financial instruments, while its former shadow partner adapted to a world of concrete walls and regimented time. Today, The tangible traces are fading. The specific companies he used are dissolved. The union officials corrupted have been replaced. The old haunts are gone. The legacy is not in a preserved building you can visit, but in the regulatory reforms that followed his prosecutions, in the increased scrutiny of the construction and waste industries, in the very fact that later projects were built under a different, more competitive set of rules. The cityscape is his monument in reverse. Its continued growth and changing skyline are testaments to the gradual erosion of the specific systems he exploited. To seek Barney Bellomo in New York now is to look for ghosts in the daylight. You will not find a street named for him, but you might find a luxury condo built on a site where a mob-connected developer once held sway. You will not find a social club, but you might find a bustling restaurant in a neighborhood that was once too perilous for such open investment. The landscape tells the story of his presence through the evidence of his eventual absence, through the city's slow, difficult healing from the kind of deep, quiet corruption he mastered. It is a geography of erasure, where the most significant marks are the ones that have been painstakingly scrubbed away, leaving only the faintest stain on the city's memory. A stain visible only to those who know precisely where, and how, to look. The narrative of Barney Bellomo, when stripped of its criminal context, transforms into a stark and universal parable about the nature of time and the architecture of a life. His story is a masterclass in deferred gratification on an epic scale, a lifelong wager that patience and discipline would outperform impulse and passion. From his early days as a watchful youth on the streets of East Harlem, he was playing a game measured in decades, not days. While others sought immediate rewards, flashy cars, street reputations, the visceral thrill of direct confrontation, Bellomo invested in the slow, compounding interest of influence. He understood that power, like a mature forest, cannot be rushed. It must be cultivated in silence, its roots allowed to spread wide and deep through unseen soil before the canopy ever begins to dominate the landscape. His entire career was an exercise in strategic delay. He delayed personal gratification for institutional gain. He delayed violent solutions for economic ones. He delayed his own visibility, sometimes for years, to ensure its eventual impact would be untraceable. This relationship with time is what truly separated him from his peers. They lived in the frantic present, reacting to slights and seizing short-term opportunities. He lived in a carefully calculated future, one where his actions in the present were mere seeds for harvests he might not personally reap. His guilty pleas and prison sentences were the ultimate expression of this long-game philosophy. He accepted the loss of a decade of freedom not as a defeat, but as a necessary investment in the future stability of the family and the preservation of his methods. He was willing to let the clock run on his own life, confident that the system he built would be waiting, intact and profitable, on the other side. This creates a haunting portrait of a life meticulously planned yet ultimately confined, a masterpiece of strategy painted on the canvas of a prison cell. The architecture of such a life is one of astonishing self-control and profound sacrifice. Every relationship, every decision, every word spoken was a brick placed with the final structure in mind. There was no room for spontaneity, for frivolity, for the unplanned joys and connections that give most lives their texture and warmth. His life was a fortress, and while it was impervious to external assault, it was also, by design, inhospitable to the softer, more chaotic elements of the human experience. He architected himself out of his own humanity, building a monument of will where a person used to be. The tragedy, or perhaps the chilling success, of this architecture is that it worked exactly as intended. It achieved its goal of enduring influence. But when we examine the finished structure, we are left to wonder about the cost of the blueprint. What was it like to be Barney Bellomo in the quiet moments? When the calculations were done and the messages had been passed, who was left in the silence? A man who had so thoroughly fused his identity with an institution likely experienced a terrifying emptiness when finally alone, a void where a personal self should have been. His life becomes a cautionary tale about the endpoint of pure rationality applied to the irrational project of living. It asks whether a life can be considered successful if it achieves all its strategic objectives but fails to include any of the unplanned beauty, love, and connection that make existence meaningful. His legacy is one of immense control and immense loneliness, a trade-off he seems to have made consciously and without visible regret. In the end, time, the very element he sought to master, may have been his most profound and subtle adversary. It granted him the longevity to see his system work, but it also forced him to live within the sterile confines of that system for every one of those years. It allowed his legend to grow in the underworld, but it also ensured that legend would be one of absence and silence, not of warmth or remembrance. He won his game against his rivals and against the federal government, but he may have lost his game against time itself, for time inevitably asks the question, what was it all for? And in the echoing chambers of his meticulously constructed life, the answer comes back not in triumphs or treasures, but in the hollow sound of a silence he spent a lifetime cultivating, a silence that now defines him completely. A man who built an empire of whispers and in doing so, whispered away his own soul. To the relentless, uncaring passage of the years that were his only true currency and his final, inescapable judge. Within the insular, hypermasculine world of La Cosa Nostra, a world built on rigid codes and brutal hierarchies, Barney Bellomo cultivated a unique and formidable form of intellectual capital that became his most potent weapon and the core of his legend. This was not the capital of brute force or inherited position, though he commanded both. It was the capital of insight, foresight, and strategic patience. He understood earlier and more completely than his peers that the American Mafia of the late 20th century was no longer competing against rival gangs or corrupt local cops. It was competing against the information age and the legal revolution of RICO. In this new battlefield, the traditional assets, loyal soldiers, fear-inspiring enforcers, control of street corners, were becoming liabilities. They were data points for the FBI, narrative hooks for prosecutors, and flashpoints for internal betrayal. Bellomo's genius was in recognizing that the family's most valuable asset needed to be its collective intelligence, its ability to think several moves ahead of an opponent that had the full force of the state and technology at its disposal. He invested in this intellectual capital relentlessly. He promoted men not for their willingness to commit violence, but for their ability to earn money quietly and manage complex schemes. He valued accountants over arsonists, strategists over shooters. He fostered a culture where the smartest move was always the least conspicuous one, where a well-placed bribe to a union official or a strategic campaign donation was worth 1,000 threats. This elevated the Genovese family's operations from thuggery to a form of grey market venture capitalism. They were no longer just extorting businesses, they were infiltrating markets, rigging bids, and establishing monopolies, activities that required a sophisticated understanding of law, finance, and politics. Bellomo himself became the chief intelligence officer of this shadow corporation. His brilliance lay in synthesis, in taking the raw, often chaotic, information flowing from the streets, the docks, the construction sites, and the courtrooms, and synthesizing it into a coherent strategy. He could look at a stalled building project and see not just a problem for a shylarking victim, but an opportunity to insert a mob-connected contractor. He could see a new environmental regulation for waste disposal and understand how to turn it into a barrier to entry for competitors, solidifying his cartel's control. This intellectual capital also extended to human psychology. He mastered the art of the unspoken threat, the power of implied consequences. He knew that letting a debtor sweat was often more effective than breaking his knees, as it created a lasting lesson in dread that would inform that man's future decisions and serve as a quiet advertisement to others. He understood the precise pressure points of ambition, fear, and greed in businessmen, union leaders, and even his own men. This deep, analytical understanding of motive and fear allowed him to control vast systems with minimal direct intervention. His mind became a silent central processor for a sprawling criminal network, assessing risk, allocating resources, and issuing calibrated responses, all through layers of intermediaries. This focus on intellect over impulse had a profound stabilizing effect. It reduced the unpredictable variable of human emotion that had doomed so many of his contemporaries. While a Gotti or a Casso might order a murder in a fit of rage, creating a cascade of investigations and retaliations, Bellomo would sanction violence only after a cold cost-benefit analysis, and even then, only as a last resort when all other forms of pressure had failed or when the strategic necessity was overwhelming. This made his violence rare, precise, and extraordinarily difficult to prosecute, as it was stripped of the personal animus that often leaves behind witnesses and clues. It was clinical, not passionate. In the end, Barney Bellomo's most enduring contribution to the law of organized crime was this demonstration that brains could utterly triumph over brawn, that in the modern era, the most dangerous gangster was the one who never had to raise his voice or his fist, because he had already won the war in the quiet chamber of his own mind, having outthought not only his rivals, but the very nature of the game itself. He redefined the currency of the underworld, proving that in an age of surveillance and snitches, the most valuable currency was not cash, but a thought that was never spoken aloud, a plan that left no footprint, and the terrifying, quiet certainty of a man who knows he has already calculated every possible outcome, and is patiently waiting for the world to catch up to the future he has already arranged. His intellectual capital was his true empire, and it was one that no prison cell could ever strip from him, for it resided in the systems he designed and the fearful, obedient logic he implanted in the minds of everyone who operated within the vast, silent shadow he cast. The concept of loyalty within the universe of Barney Bellomo was a cold, brittle, and meticulously managed commodity, stripped of sentiment and reforged into a mechanism of pure operational utility. In the popular mythology of the mob, loyalty is often portrayed as a sacred, blood-bound oath, a romanticized bond of brotherhood stronger than family. Bellomo's handling of the concept revealed a far more pragmatic and chilling reality. For him, loyalty was not an emotion. It was a renewable resource to be cultivated, a security protocol to be enforced, and, when necessary, a liability to be excised with surgical precision. He understood that in an ecosystem defined by betrayal and the overwhelming pressure of RICO sentences, blind, passionate loyalty was a dangerous vulnerability. A man loyal out of love or fervor could have that love tested or that fervor crushed by the prospect of decades in prison. Therefore, Bellomo engineered a different kind of fidelity, one based on intertwined self-interest and systemic dependency. He fostered loyalty not through charismatic inspiration, but through the consistent, predictable, and highly profitable functioning of the system he oversaw. A captain in his regime was loyal because the system provided him a steady, significant income, clear rules of engagement that minimized his personal risk, and a structure that protected his crew from the chaotic incursions of other families. The loyalty was to the paycheck and the protection, not to the man. Bellomo himself was merely the most vital component of that profitable machine, its chief engineer. This made the loyalty he commanded more durable, as it was rooted in rational self-preservation rather than fleeting emotion. It was a business relationship of the most severe kind. Conversely, his loyalty to his subordinates was equally transactional. He was loyal to them as long as they performed their functions flawlessly, generated revenue, and maintained impeccable operational security. He provided them with opportunities and protection. The moment a soldier became a liability, through indiscretion, incompetence, or the attention of law enforcement, that bond of utility was severed. Bellomo's loyalty to the institution of the Genovese family superseded any loyalty to an individual within it. This is where his true allegiance lay, to the abstract entity, the enduring concept of the family as a perpetual, profit-generating organism. Individuals were cells in that organism. Some flourished, some were replaced. The health of the whole was all that mattered. This institutional loyalty allowed him to make decisions that seemed brutally disloyal on a personal level but were perfectly logical from a systemic perspective. Recommending the sanctioning of a once trusted captain who had become a talkative risk was not a betrayal in his calculus. It was a necessary system update, a patch to fix a security flaw. This redefinition turned the old-world concept of omerta inside out. The code of silence was no longer a sacred oath among brothers. It was a non-negotiable employment contract with fatal penalties for breach of confidentiality. Bellomo enforced this not with fiery lectures about honor, but with the chilling certainty of consequences. The fear of being cut off from the income, the respect, and the protection of the family, followed by the potential for more dire sanctions, was a far more powerful motivator than any abstract ideal. He created a world where disloyalty was not just morally wrong, it was economically and existentially stupid. This system also ingeniously managed the greatest threat to loyalty, the Federal Witness Protection Program. By minimizing unnecessary violence and fostering a stable, profitable environment, Bellomo reduced the number of men who felt backed into a corner and desperate enough to flip. By dealing with problems through ostracization and financial pressure rather than immediate murder, he gave potential informants a less dire alternative to cooperation. And for those who did choose to betray, their betrayal was against the system, not against a beloved leader, which made their testimony seem more like the grudge of a fired employee than the shattered oath of a devoted follower. This cool, impersonal framing could subtly undermine their credibility. In the final analysis, Barney Bellomo solved the loyalty problem that had crippled other families by draining it of all its heat and passion. He turned it into a cool, hard, sustainable fuel for his engine of quiet control. His men were not devoted disciples. They were well-compensated, carefully managed executives in a criminal conglomerate. Their loyalty was to the bottom line and their own survival within the corporate structure. This was loyalty that could survive the boss's imprisonment, because the corporation outlived its CEO. It was loyalty that could withstand tremendous external pressure, because the alternative was not just breaking an oath, but opting out of a lucrative and deeply entrenched economic system. In this, Bellomo achieved the ultimate perversion of the mob's core myth. He proved that the strongest loyalty is not born in blood and fire, but in the silent, reliable, and ruthless logic of a well-designed machine, a machine where every cog, including the master cog himself, is ultimately replaceable, and where the only truly sacred, unbreakable bond is the one that binds every component to the perpetuation of the machine itself. A bond forged not in honor, but in the cold, calculating understanding of mutual utility and the profound, unspoken dread of being cast out of the only world that makes sense to those who have chosen to live within its shadowed, silent walls. To fully grasp the totality of Barney Bellomo's journey, one must engage in a final, sweeping reflection that moves beyond chronology and analysis into the realm of legacy's echo. His story does not conclude with a definitive period, but with a lingering, resonant silence that continues to shape perceptions of power, crime, and consequence. He has become less a man and more a paradigm, a ghostly template against which both illicit enterprises and the forces that combat them measure themselves. In the years since his peak, the world has accelerated into a digital age of infinite connectivity and pervasive surveillance, conditions that would seem to spell doom for his analog, interpersonal model of control. Yet, the opposite may be true. The Bellomo doctrine of silence, patience, and deep institutional embedding has found new, fertile ground in the virtual shadows. The modern cybercriminal, the corrupt oligarch, the sophisticated fraudster, all operate on Bellomo-esque principles. Maximize profit, minimize visible footprint, leverage systemic vulnerabilities, and build structures that survive the individual. His insistence on insulating leadership from direct action is the precursor to using cryptocurrencies and shell companies. His relay system of communication prefigures encrypted apps and dead-drop digital exchanges. His focus on corrupting essential industries finds its parallel in hacking critical infrastructure or manipulating online markets. He demonstrated that the highest form of criminality is not about breaking the system, but about becoming an invisible, parasitic part of its operating code, a lesson that has never been more relevant. Thus, his influence extends into a future he likely never envisioned, proving that his strategies were not time-bound, but were fundamental insights into the nature of illicit power in any complex society. For the city of New York, his legacy is a phantom limb, an ache of memory where pervasive corruption once attached. The skyline he helped tax now sprouts towers funded by global capital flows he wouldn't recognize. Yet the instinct to find hidden levers and quiet monopolies persists in the city's endless hustle. His story is a permanent part of the city's dark folklore, a reminder that its glittering success was hard-won against not just economic cycles, but against silent, internal rot. The bureaucratic and legal reforms born from the fight against his kind, the stricter oversight of unions, the anti-racketeering laws applied to Wall Street, the forensic auditing of public contracts, are his unintended, positive bequest, the city's immune response to the pathogen he represented. In a personal sense, his life stands as a monument to the power of choice and its irrevocable costs. At countless moments, from a teenager on a Harlem stoop to a young captain overseeing concrete pours to an acting boss weighing a plea deal, he made choices that steadily narrowed his world, trading the boundless potential of an ordinary life for the immense but strictly bounded power of a secret king. Each choice reinforced the last, building the walls of his personal and professional prison ever higher, until the architecture of his existence was complete. A masterpiece of control, encompassing and constricting everything within it, including himself. The final tragedy, or perhaps the final lesson, is that the freedom he sought, freedom from interference, from irrelevance, from the chaos of ordinary human frailty, was achieved only through a series of choices that eliminated every other kind of freedom. He is the archetype of the self-made ghost, a man who authored his own legend with such singular focus that he disappeared into the text, leaving behind not a person to be remembered, but a set of instructions on how to vanish within the machinery of power. As history continues to sift through the rubble of 20th century organized crime, the loud, violent figures will be remembered as eruptive forces, spectacular but short-lived. Barney Bellomo will be remembered as a geological force, a slow, patient pressure that shaped the landscape itself, leaving canyons of influence where others left only scars. His name will endure not because it was shouted, but because it was whispered, not because he built a myth, but because he perfected a method. And in that enduring whisper, in that cold, efficient method, lies the chilling, eternal echo of Liborio Barney Bellomo. A man who taught the world that the most formidable empire is the one you cannot see, the most unassailable fortress is built from secrets, and the most powerful ruler is the one whose presence is deduced only from the perfect, fearful order of his silent, enduring realm. The story ends, but the silence he cultivated remains, a vast and echoing monument to the terrifying potential of a will refined to its purest, most impersonal, and most effective form. The final measure of Barney Bellomo's existence may not be found in the court documents or the FBI files, but in the profound philosophical question his life poses about the nature of success itself within the confines of a chosen path. By the narrow, internal metrics of the world he embraced, he achieved a level of mastery that verges on the sublime. He ascended to the pinnacle of one of America's most secretive and powerful institutions not through hereditary right or a sudden coup, but through the steady, undeniable force of his competence. He shaped the economic reality of the world's most iconic city for decades, directing the flow of hundreds of millions of dollars with the quiet authority of a central banker for the underworld. He outmaneuvered law enforcement's most concerted efforts for years, and when he was finally captured, he transformed incarceration from a defeat into a strategic holding pattern, a testament to a system so well designed it could run on autopilot. He commanded a loyalty stripped of sentiment, a fear devoid of spectacle, and a respect born not from affection but from or at his operational perfection. Within the dark universe of organized crime, he is the closest equivalent to a flawless diamond, hard, cold, brilliant, and formed under immense, relentless pressure. If success is defined as achieving one's stated goals with maximum efficiency and minimum waste, then Barney Bellomo was one of the most successful criminals of the modern era, a virtuoso of the illicit. Yet, when we pan the camera back to the wider horizon of a human life, this picture of success fractures into a haunting mosaic of absence and negation. His success required the systematic suppression of his own humanity, his empathy, his spontaneity, his capacity for public joy, his presence as a father and husband. It demanded that he live as a spectre in the legitimate world, forever compartmentalized and hidden. It exchanged the vibrant chaos of a free life for the sterile, controlled order of a self-made prison, first metaphorical and then literal. His triumphs were invisible, his wealth could never be openly enjoyed, his power could never be acknowledged. The price of his flawless execution was a life lived in the subjunctive mood, a life of what could not be said, what could not be shown, what could not be felt. This dichotomy forces a reckoning with the very idea of a life well lived. Bellomo's existence argues that a life can be a towering success in its own terms and yet be a catastrophic failure in the universal human terms of connection, legacy, and joy. He achieved everything he set out to achieve and in doing so, hollowed out the vessel of his own being. He is the embodiment of the Pyrrhic victory, a man who won every battle so completely that he lost the war for his own soul. His story becomes a chilling meditation on the corridors we choose to walk down and the doors that permanently close behind us with each step. From the moment he took his first serious errand for the mob, a succession of doors began to slam. The door to a legitimate career, the door to unburdened relationships, the door to public honor, the door to old age in a rocking chair on a porch somewhere, the door to a eulogy that could speak of his kindness, his humor, his contributions to his community. In their place, he opened doors to secret meeting rooms, to clandestine deals, to prison visiting areas, and finally, to a cell. He built a labyrinth of immense complexity and power, but a labyrinth is still a prison, no matter how grand its design. In the end, we are left with the unsettling image of an old man in a prison uniform, a master strategist with no more moves to make, a king whose kingdom is the memory of a system he built. The silence he worshipped now surrounds him completely. The fear he cultivated is a distant tool he can no longer wield. The money he generated moves through channels he can no longer touch. All that remains is the stark fact of his choices and their ultimate destination. This is the final, quiet terror of the Barney Bellomo story. It demonstrates that a human will can be sharpened to a point so fine it can pierce through any obstacle, but it offers no solace, no warmth, no redemption on the other side. It is a story of monumental capability in the service of a tragically narrow ambition. He is both the architect and the sole inhabitant of his own magnificent, empty tomb, a tomb built not of stone, but of secrets, strategies, and a silence so profound it has swallowed the man whole. His legacy, therefore, is a double-edged sword. It is a masterclass in focused will, a case study in institutional endurance, a warning about the corrosive power of quiet corruption. But it is also, and perhaps most lastingly, a profound and sorrowful lesson about the ultimate poverty of a life that mistakes control for fulfillment, power for purpose, and silence for peace. The echo of Barney Bellomo is not the echo of a life fully lived, but the echo of a potential extinguished, a reminder that the most perfect machine, devoid of a heart, can run forever in the dark, accomplishing nothing but its own perpetual, lonely, and ultimately meaningless motion. Therefore, as we reach the final contemplation of this intricate and shadowed narrative, we must circle back to the essence of the man, not as a criminal strategist or an institutional architect, but as a human being who became a vessel for an idea. Barney Bellomo's life presents the ultimate paradox of agency. He was a man of immense, almost supernatural will, who used that will to submerge his individual self completely into a collective identity. He chose the path of the ghost, and in doing so, achieved a form of power that was entirely dependent on his own erasure. He is the definitive example of a life lived in the passive voice, where things were done, decisions were made, and influence was exerted. But the active, breathing, feeling human actor was always carefully edited out of the frame. This generates a profound emptiness at the center of his story. We can analyze his methods, measure his impact, and trace the contours of his influence, but we can never truly know him. He is the black hole at the heart of his own galaxy. We can only perceive him by the way he warped the space around him, by the silent orbits of the men and money that moved to his unseen gravity. This was, of course, his intention. He weaponized ambiguity. His power grew in direct proportion to the uncertainty about its source and its limits. Was he the boss, or merely a trusted advisor? Was he a billionaire, or a man of modest means? Was he a ruthless killer, or a pragmatic businessman? The ambiguity was the armor. To pin him down was to diminish him. In this, he achieved something perversely artistic. He turned his own life into a masterpiece of negative space, where the meaning is found in what is not said, not shown, not done. The tragedy, if one can call it that, is that this artistic achievement required the annihilation of the artist. There is no Barney Bellomo left, only the Bellomo effect, the chilling efficiency, the quiet coercion, the patient strategy. He successfully translated his consciousness into a set of operating principles, and in that translation, the original text was lost. As he now exists as an elderly man in a federal prison, one wonders what remains in the quiet of his own mind when the calculations are done. Does he replay his strategic triumphs like a grandmaster reviewing old games? Does he feel the weight of the lives ruined, the businesses crushed, the trust corroded? Or has the internal silence he cultivated become total, a perfect void where even regret cannot echo? His life forces us to confront the terrifying possibility of a fully realized will that leads not to enlightenment or fulfillment, but to a state of sublime, sterile nothingness. He sought control over everything external, and in achieving it, may have found there was nothing internal left to control. His story, then, is not a mob story in the traditional sense. It is a philosophical inquiry into the end point of pure rationality, a chilling vision of where the road of uncompromising discipline, strategic genius, and a moral focus ultimately leads. It leads to a room, small and secure, where a man who once moved millions with a whisper now sits, the author of a vast, silent epic in which he wrote himself out of the final chapter. The empire of whispers endures in concept, but the whisperer himself has been consumed by the silence he so loved. In the grand, noisy pageant of human history, filled with conquerors and artists, revolutionaries and visionaries, Barney Bellomo carved out a unique and unsettling niche. He became history's quietest king, a ruler whose most enduring decree was the edict of his own absence, proving in the end that the most absolute power is not the power to command, but the power to disappear, leaving behind only the unsettling, unshakable feeling that you are still being watched, still being guided, still being controlled by a hand you can never see, in a game whose rules were written by a man who vanished into the first line of his own story. And so, his tale concludes not with a bang or a whimper, but with the slow, steady fading of a shadow at dusk, leaving us with the night, and the unsettling knowledge that some darknesses are not born from the absence of light, but from something that dwells within it, perfectly adapted, perfectly patient, and perfectly, profoundly silent. The story of Liborio Barney Bellomo is over. The echo of his silence is just beginning. Now, as the final words on this journey settle, we must turn our gaze outward from the silent world of Barney Bellomo and reflect on why his story, a narrative woven in shadows and spoken in whispers, demands our attention and, more importantly, our vigilance. You have joined us in unraveling the complex tapestry of a life lived in deliberate obscurity, a testament to the terrifying efficiency of power that operates not through roar, but through a pervasive, chilling quiet. We have walked the unseen corridors of his influence, from the sun-baked streets of East Harlem to the boardrooms he never entered, from the prison yards that became his office to the soaring towers that are his unintended, anonymous monuments. This was not a story of flamboyant evil, but of a quiet, calculating corrosion, a reminder that the most dangerous forces are often those that make the least noise. Barney Bellomo's legacy is a masterclass in the manipulation of systems and the psychology of fear, a blueprint that, while rooted in the world of organized crime, holds up a dark mirror to any structure where power concentrates and accountability fades. His life asks us pointed, uncomfortable questions about our own world. Where are the silent pressures shaping our markets, our politics, our daily lives? Who benefits from the rules that are whispered, not written? What unseen costs are baked into the foundations of the things we take for granted? He demonstrated that corruption is not always a loud scandal. Sometimes, it is the silent, smooth functioning of a rigged game, where everyone plays by rules they never agreed to but are too afraid, or too compromised, to challenge. His story is a cautionary tale for the citizen, the entrepreneur, the voter, and the thinker. It warns us that the health of a society is measured not just by the absence of loud violence, but by the presence of transparent, fair, and accessible systems that leave no fertile ground for silent cartels to take root. It is a call to value noise, the noise of a free press, of public debate, of whistleblowers, of judicial transparency, as the essential disinfectant against the kind of power that thrives only in silence. The very fact that we can tell this story, that we can piece together the fragments from court records and investigative journalism, is a victory against the silence he embodied. Each subpoena, each declassified file, each insider's testimony, is a crack in the wall of omerta. By listening to this story, you have participated in breaking that silence. And this is where our final, and most important, call to action resides. This channel is dedicated to pulling back the curtains on the hidden histories, the quiet empires, and the untold stories that shape our reality. We commit to the meticulous research, the sifting of sources, and the careful narration that stories like this demand. But we cannot do this essential work without you. Your engagement is the counterweight to the silence. By subscribing to this channel, you are not just passively watching. You are casting a vote for illumination over obscurity. You are supporting a platform dedicated to turning whispers into discernible speech, shadows into defined shapes. Hitting the notification bell ensures you are present for the next deep dive, the next exploration of the truths that lurk in the margins of history and headlines. Each share, each comment, each moment of your attention amplifies this work and helps build a community that values understanding over ignorance, clarity over obscurity. The story of Barney Bellomo proves that silence is a weapon. Let us prove together that attention, curiosity, and a demand for truth are the tools to dismantle it. We have spent this time in the company of a ghost. Now, let's step back into the light. Thank you for listening. Thank you for your time. If you found this journey into the silent empire compelling, please show your support. Subscribe to the channel, ring the bell for notifications, and share this video with others who appreciate stories told with depth and respect for the complexity of truth. There are countless other narratives waiting in the wings, other hidden figures and forgotten schemes, and with your support, we will continue to bring them into the light, one meticulously researched story at a time. This has been our examination of Liborio Barney Bellomo. Until next time, stay curious, and remember, the most powerful stories are often the ones that were never meant to be told.